It began in fire, in the dying winter of the Reich. By the beginning of 1945, the Eastern Front was collapsing. The Red Army, victorious at Stalingrad and Kursk, had crossed Poland in a storm of vengeance. To the Soviet soldiers marching west, East Prussia was not just another battlefield. It was German soil, the heart of the enemy that had invaded their homeland in 1941. Every ruined village, every burned home behind them, cried out for retribution. And now, as the snows melted into rivers of mud and blood, that retribution was coming. In January, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Chernyakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front struck the German lines in a massive offensive. Their target, the East Prussian capital, Königsberg. Königsberg was no ordinary city. Founded in the 13th century by the Teutonic Knights, it was once the jewel of the Prussian state, a place of cathedrals and universities, of order and culture. But by 1945, it was a fortress. Hitler had declared it a Festung, a fortress city, to be defended at all costs. Its garrison numbered over 120,000, including regular Wehrmacht troops, Volkssturm militia, and remnants of shattered divisions retreating from the front. Its civilian population, swollen to more than 300,000 by refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, was trapped inside. The city was surrounded by trenches, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and gun emplacements, forming one of the most heavily fortified positions on the Eastern Front. To the east and south lay the Red Army, over 250,000 men, with tanks, artillery, and air superiority. To the west, the Baltic Sea, cold, grey, and impassable. Königsberg was a fortress, yes, but it was also a prison. The Soviet assault began in January, part of the East Prussian offensive, one of the most brutal operations of the entire war. Soviet tanks rolled across frozen fields, their treads grinding over ice and corpses. German units, cut off and isolated, fought with desperate ferocity. The Red Army's advance was relentless, but it came at a terrible cost. Entire villages were annihilated, their inhabitants caught between two armies. The skies above Königsberg filled with bombers, and by the end of the month, the city was burning. Streets that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Civilians huddled in basements as artillery shells pounded the city day and night. The smell of smoke and death hung over everything. By February, Königsberg was surrounded. The German Fourth Army, trapped to the south in the Heiligenbeil pocket, tried to break through, but it was too late. The Soviet encirclement was complete. For the next 2 months, the city held out, supplied only by sea through the port of Pillau. The Kriegsmarine, risking everything, ferried in ammunition and food under constant air attack, while evacuating refugees in Operation Hannibal, one of the largest sea evacuations in history, but the situation grew hopeless. Every day, Soviet artillery pounded the city. Every night, fires raged through the ruins. Disease spread, food ran out, and still the defenders fought on, soldiers and civilians alike, clinging to the illusion that help might come, that Hitler's armies might somehow turn the tide. The final assault came in April 1945. On the 6th, Soviet forces launched their full-scale attack. Over 5,000 guns opened fire, pounding Königsberg in one of the heaviest bombardments of the war. The earth shook. Buildings crumbled. The air was filled with dust and fire. Then, from every direction, the Red Army advanced, storming the outer defenses, crossing moats, and blasting through bunkers with flamethrowers and explosives. The fighting was street by street, house by house, cellar by cellar. Soviet tanks crushed barricades, their treads grinding over the stones of medieval streets. German soldiers fought from windows, from church towers, from the ruins of their homes. The Volkssturm, old men and boys, fired rifles against tanks, while the wounded lay where they fell, frozen in the mud. The city became a slaughterhouse. The commander of the fortress, General Otto Larsch, knew the end was near. His troops were exhausted. Ammunition was nearly gone. The once proud capital of East Prussia was now a ruin. Its medieval heart turned to ash, its people starving or dead. On April 9th, after 3 days of apocalyptic fighting, Larsch made the decision that Hitler had forbidden. He surrendered. The Red Army entered the shattered city, their flags flying above the ruins. For the Germans it was the end of a world. For the Soviets it was revenge fulfilled. The capture of Königsberg cost them over 70,000 casualties, but it marked the final destruction of Prussia's military power. The city, once the symbol of German pride and discipline, was gone. In the aftermath, the scale of devastation was beyond comprehension. Entire districts had been obliterated. Tens of thousands of civilians lay dead in the streets or buried beneath the rubble. Those who survived faced a new nightmare: deportation, disease, and starvation under Soviet occupation. The city that had stood for 700 years was erased from the map. In 1946, the Soviets renamed it Kaliningrad, after the Bolshevik leader Mikhail Kalinin. Its German population was expelled, its landmarks demolished, its memory rewritten. The city of Kunt and the coronation site of Prussian kings was gone, swallowed by war and history. Yet, even in ruin, the story of Königsberg endures. It was more than a battle. It was the final heartbeat of a vanished world. Prussia, once the heart of German identity, had ceased to exist. The ideals of discipline, order, and power that had defined it for centuries were buried beneath the rubble of its capital. The fall of Königsberg was not just a military defeat, it was a symbolic death, the moment when the Empire of the Sword gave way to the Empire of Ashes. Today, Kaliningrad stands where Königsberg once did, a Russian city built on the bones of Prussia. But if you walk its streets beneath the modern buildings and concrete, you can still feel it, the ghost of the old city, the weight of history beneath the soil. The walls may have fallen, but the echoes remain, the sound of artillery over the Pregel River, the cries in the burning night, the silence that followed when the guns went quiet. Tonight we return to that final stand, to the fortress city that defied the inevitable, to the streets where an empire died, and to the soldiers who fought until the end of history itself. This is the entire history of the Battle of Königsberg, Prussia's final stand, where the flames of war consumed not only a city, but an entire civilization. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere surrounded by quiet and peace, or listening from afar as history whispers through the night once more? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. Winter of 1944, East Prussia. Along the icy banks of the Pregel River, a pair of Soviet reconnaissance Yakovlev fighters circled low above Königsberg, their cameras clicking through thick clouds as the grey city appeared beneath them, like a patchwork of bastions, spires, and stone walls. Through the fog, they captured the outlines of forts that had stood since the reign of Emperor Wilhelm I, their star-shaped ramparts clearly visible from the air. These photographs, catalogued by the Red Army's Second Belarusian Front, revealed a city unlike any other they had faced in the East. Königsberg was not just a settlement, but a defensive organism, a fortress with teeth sharpened over centuries. Reports from the reconnaissance units emphasized the sheer density of defensive belts, making comparisons to Warsaw or Minsk inadequate. Here the Soviets were not approaching a provincial capital, but the symbolic heart of Prussian militarism. Each bastion, each moat, each layer of defense carried the weight of history and the promise of brutal resistance. For the men scanning those photographs in Moscow, the question grew urgent: how could such a fortress be broken? By late November of 1944, aerial reconnaissance had confirmed the existence of 15 major forts arranged in an arc around the city, their brick walls measuring over 10 meters thick in places. Fort Friedrich, Fort König Friedrich Wilhelm III, and Fort Donner towered above the surrounding marshes, their vaulted casemates reinforced with concrete after the Franco-Prussian War. These were not relics abandoned to time, but structures constantly upgraded with steel doors, machine gun nests, and interlocking fields of fire. Soviet engineers studying the photographs noted how the forts were linked by covered passages and flanked by artificial lakes, created by damming rivers, creating kill zones against advancing infantry. Unlike the fortress cities of Brest-Litovsk or Grodno, Königsberg's defenses represented a hybrid, 19th century architecture reinforced with 20th century ingenuity. This meant that conventional bombardment would not automatically open the way. The implication was clear: storming Königsberg would require resources far beyond those used in earlier East Prussian battles. The German perspective reinforced this sense of strength. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry declared Königsberg Prussia's shield, a fortress immune to Soviet artillery, the last bastion of German honor in the East. German newsreels of autumn 1944 showed children in Hitler Youth uniforms drilling in parade squares, while Wehrmacht officers gestured to maps of concentric defensive belts. In reality, however, the fortress was a paradox. Its population had swollen to nearly 570,000, with roughly 200,000 refugees pouring in from villages destroyed during Operation Bagration. The walls that promised safety also created overcrowding, hunger, and a constant stream of civilian appeals to city commandant General Otto Lasch. The Soviets knew this contradiction well. A fortress built to repel armies might collapse under the weight of those it sought to shelter. Comparisons between German pride and Soviet firepower grew sharper with each intelligence report. The Red Army's heavy artillery regiments had proven their ability to reduce fortifications in Sevastopol and Budapest, employing guns like the 203mm howitzers, capable of delivering shells weighing over 100 kilograms. Yet Königsberg's forts were designed precisely to absorb such impacts, their casemates buried beneath layers of earth and angled brickwork that deflected incoming rounds. Engineers recalled German reports from the Siege of Paris in 1870, where similar bastions had endured weeks of shelling with minimal effect. Soviet strategists understood that unlike Warsaw's modern urban grid, Königsberg offered a labyrinth of moats and angled walls that could channel entire divisions into narrow killing fields. This set the stage for one of the most complex siege operations of the war. Field evidence confirmed these challenges. In December of 1944, Soviet infantry probes near the approaches to Fort Grolman were met with devastating fire from concealed bunkers. Survivors reported Maxim machine guns positioned behind armored shutters, their arcs of fire sweeping across frozen fields illuminated by flares, mines, wire obstacles, and anti-tank ditches nearly 5 meters wide forced attackers into predictable choke points. Reports by the 28th Army noted casualty rates of up to 20% during minor reconnaissance engagements, an unacceptable figure for probing actions. These early contacts taught Soviet officers that Königsberg was not merely a city with defenses, but a fortress actively prepared for the coming storm. If such losses occurred in limited engagements, the full assault promised to be bloodier still. The broader implications reached beyond the battlefield. Königsberg represented not only a military stronghold, but a psychological one. For Germans, it was the birthplace of Immanuel Kant and the coronation site of Prussian kings. A city woven into national identity. For Soviets, capturing it would mark the symbolic destruction of Prussian militarism, a victory carrying equal weight to the fall of Berlin. The Stavka's intelligence assessments of January 1945 emphasized this dual importance, noting that the city's fall would secure the Baltic flank for operations against Berlin, while also sending a clear message to both allies and enemies. This was not simply a matter of artillery and infantry, but of political will and morale. The siege of Königsberg would therefore be fought in the minds of soldiers and civilians as much as in its trenches and forts. Further supporting evidence came from German documentation itself. A report filed in September 1944 by General Georg Hans Reinhardt of Army Group Center described Königsberg as a fortress capable of withstanding a siege of months if supplied adequately. He warned, however, that with Army Group Center shattered by Operation Bagration, the supply corridors from the Vistula were tenuous at best, ammunition stocks were estimated at 30% of requirement, and food reserves were stretched to feed hundreds of thousands of civilians now trapped within the walls. Soviet intelligence intercepted fragments of these communications, confirming the growing pressure on the German command. The fortress was strong, but its foundation logistics was already cracking. The human consequences soon became visible. Soviet aerial observers noted columns of civilians trudging toward the city gates, their carts piled high with bedding, furniture, and livestock. Inside ration cards reduced daily bread allotments to 200 grams per person, and fuel shortages left entire districts without heating during the harsh East Prussian winter. German police records show rising arrests for looting and desertion, a sign that the fortress mentality was fraying under the weight of desperation. General Lasch attempted to maintain order with decrees promising harsh penalties, but his proclamations carried diminishing authority as hunger and fear grew. For the Soviet reconnaissance officers, these human details added a new dimension to their photographs, a fortress city that could repel shells but not starvation. By the first weeks of January 1945, the question sharpened into a paradox. Could a fortress built in the age of muskets and bayonets withstand the shock of Katyusha rocket salvos, Soviet heavy artillery, and modern combined arms assault? The photographs suggested resilience, yet reports of shortages suggested weakness. Commanders of the Third Belarusian Front debated whether Königsberg would collapse like Warsaw, burn like Stalingrad, or endure like Sevastopol. The Soviets had mapped the walls, catalogued the forts, and measured the moats, but the city still withheld its secret. The stage was set, but the outcome was uncertain. As the winter deepened, one question lingered above all others. Could Königsberg, Prussia's shield, survive the firestorm that was about to descend? June 22, 1944, Belarus, near the marshes of the Berezina River. Soviet artillery opened fire at dawn, thousands of guns unleashing a thunderclap that rolled across the plains, marking the beginning of Operation Bagration. Within hours, the Fourth Army of German Army Group Center was in full retreat, its front lines collapsing under the combined weight of the 1st Baltic, 1st Belarusian, Second Belarusian, and Third Belarusian fronts. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, serving as Stalin's chief of coordination for the offensive, reported to Moscow that the Wehrmacht positions had been penetrated up to 20 kilometers in a single day. By July, the collapse was total. German units reported entire divisions such as the 31st Infantry Division reduced to fragments of a few hundred men. The Reich's defensive wall in the east, once thought impregnable, had crumbled. For Stalin and Stavka, the map now pointed toward East Prussia. The technical scale of Bagration was unlike anything the Germans had faced. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and over 5,000 aircraft, struck against roughly 800,000 Germans. In terms of firepower, the Red Army fielded more than 120 artillery pieces per kilometer on critical sectors, a density that turned German trenches into pulverized earthworks within hours. Reports from captured officers revealed that the Germans lacked fuel for even a quarter of their vehicles, leaving artillery abandoned as Soviet spearheads raced forward. Railway timetables seized from German headquarters showed supply deliveries at less than 40% of requirement, crippling Army Group Center's ability to maneuver. The sheer imbalance of men and machines created an unstoppable momentum. This momentum would not stop at the Polish frontier. It pointed toward East Prussia's fortress heart. The contrast between Army Group Center and Army Group North illustrated the danger facing Königsberg. While Army Group North clung desperately to positions around Riga and the Baltic coastline, supported by naval supply through ports like Liebau and Windau, Army Group Center had been torn to pieces. Soviet tank brigades of the 5th Guards Tank Army advanced nearly 600 kilometers in 5 weeks, a pace that rivaled the German blitzkrieg of 1940. Königsberg, sitting at the far edge of East Prussia, now lay exposed, its rear shield stripped away by the loss of Belarus. In Berlin, the Oberkommando des Heeres staff maps highlighted East Prussia as a protruding bulge, vulnerable on 3 sides to Soviet encirclement. The situation was no longer theoretical, it was a countdown. Hitler's orders to hold at all costs became less a strategy and more a death sentence for those inside the fortress. The field evidence of German collapse emerged in brutal clarity. By mid-July 1944, the Soviets captured Minsk, along with 50,000 prisoners, including 4 German generals. Aerial reconnaissance documented endless columns of abandoned trucks, smashed Panzer IV hulls, and wagons left rotting on roadsides. Reports from Soviet interrogators described German prisoners in rags, many without weapons, starving after weeks of retreat. In some sectors, entire Volksgrenadier units existed only on paper, their soldiers dead or missing. For Stavka, this proved the Wehrmacht's inability to defend East Prussia with conventional forces. Stalin, Zhukov, and Alexander Vasilevsky met in Moscow on August 1st to debate their next step, reviewing captured maps and intelligence reports that showed Königsberg cut off from meaningful reinforcement. The fortress myth still existed, but the field evidence told another story. The city could be strangled. The implications for the Eastern Front were massive. East Prussia was not simply another province. It was German soil, the symbolic heart of Prussian militarism, and the staging ground for invasions of Russia for centuries. Its loss would not only weaken the Wehrmacht strategically, but also strike at the psychological core of the German war effort. Stalin recognized this and pressed his generals to accelerate planning for an East Prussian offensive. Capturing Königsberg would secure the Soviet northern flank for the advance on Berlin, cutting off Army Group North from retreat into Germany proper. Soviet intelligence estimates projected that the fall of Königsberg would isolate nearly 600,000 German troops in the Baltic, sealing their fate. In essence, the destruction of Army Group Center had opened the door to the Reich itself. The next blow would fall on East Prussia. Additional evidence of German weakness came from Hitler's reliance on the Volkssturm. By October 1944, orders from Berlin demanded that every male between the ages of 16 and 60, not already in the Wehrmacht, be conscripted for local defense. In East Prussia, this meant civilians, students, and old men drilled with obsolete rifles, many dating back to the First World War. Reports from Gauleiter Erich Koch's office show frantic requisitions for weapons, often delivering captured Czech carbines or single-shot anti-tank rifles, no longer effective against Soviet armor. Unlike the trained Soviet reservists rotated from Siberia, the Volkssturm lacked cohesion, mobility, and fire support. The reliance on such formations underscored the desperation of the German position. It was not the strength of the fortress that drew attention, but its fragility. The human consequences began to unfold in real time. As Operation Bagration's shockwaves rippled eastward, refugees poured into Königsberg by the tens of thousands. German police records from October 1944 record more than 200,000 civilians crammed into the city, joining its pre-war population of 370,000. Trains arriving from Insterburg and Gumbinnen carried entire families, livestock, and carts, filling Königsberg's medieval streets with chaos. Food rationing collapsed under the weight of demand, reducing daily allotments to under 200 grams of bread per person. Disease spread quickly in the overcrowded shelters, and medical supplies dwindled to near zero. For Stavka, these reports were not ignored. A fortress filled with refugees was not a fortress at all. It was a humanitarian disaster waiting to be exploited. By December of 1944, the stage was set for the final act. Soviet forces now massed more than 2.5 million men against roughly 580,000 Germans defending East Prussia. Hitler's orders left no room for maneuver, no space for retreat, and no chance for relief. The maps laid out in Moscow showed Königsberg as the linchpin, the fortress city that symbolized both defiance and collapse. For Stalin, the question was no longer if East Prussia could be isolated, but when the destruction of Army Group Center had already written the prelude. The only mystery left was how long Königsberg could endure before Soviet firepower reduced Prussia's shield to rubble. January 13th, 1945, Nemmersdorf, East Prussia. At precisely 0700 hours, the Soviet artillery of the Third Belarusian Front unleashed a salvo of over 3,000 guns, their shells screaming across frozen fields and detonating with concussive force that shattered the brittle winter air. The bombardment fell upon the remnants of the German Fourth Army, entrenched behind hastily constructed earthworks and barbed wire, many positions reinforced only by civilians pressed into Volkssturm service. The ground trembled beneath dozens of consecutive barrages, reducing timbered buildings to splinters and ripping craters up to 15 meters across, while smoke and frost mingled in an opaque haze over the village. Soldiers and civilians alike clutched what cover they could find, noting in diaries the unnatural precision of Soviet fire coordinated across regimental sectors spanning 12 kilometers of front. By mid-morning, radio intercepts indicated multiple German battalions had lost more than 30% of their effective strength. The first echoes of the January storm were already inscribing themselves into East Prussia's history. Königsberg, far to the north, would soon feel the shockwaves. Technical reports filed by the Third Belarusian Front reveal the meticulous planning behind the offensive. General Ivan Chernyakhovsky, later replaced by Hovhannes Bagration after his death, had marshaled nearly 700 artillery pieces per division, each firing coordinated schedules of high explosive, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds. Observers recorded that each shell delivered over 100 kilograms of TNT equivalent, sufficient to collapse fortified bunkers with concrete walls 3 meters thick. Sappers attached field telephones along the front lines to synchronize timing with creeping artillery barrages, ensuring that Soviet infantry could advance behind rolling fire without encountering open gaps. The engineering precision contrasted sharply with German defenses, where trenches and pillboxes had been patched hurriedly, often using displaced civilians' labor. The practical consequence was immediate. Where German soldiers expected shelter, Soviet shells demolished cover and disrupted command and control. Reports from captured documents, including a January 15th Wehrmacht field order, noted that the enemy could no longer mount coordinated fire, and panic spread through units unaccustomed to such concentrated bombardment. Comparative analysis further highlighted the imbalance. While the Germans relied on static fortifications, reinforced occasionally with railway guns or 50-year-old coastal artillery, the Soviets applied maneuver and massed firepower simultaneously. Soviet infantry divisions advanced an average of 8 kilometers per day under artillery support, while German formations, some numbering less than 2,000 men each, struggled to consolidate defensive lines. Where German officers attempted counterattacks near Gumbinnen with elements of the 39th Infantry Division, they were repelled within hours by mobile tank brigades equipped with T-30-485S and IS-2 heavy tanks. Commanders noted in after-action reports that the German anti-tank weapons, mostly Panzerfausts and obsolete Pak-36 guns, were ineffective against frontal Soviet armor, a technological mismatch with lethal consequences. The contrast underscored a new reality. Static defense could no longer withstand modern combined arms assaults. Königsberg's mythic strength would be tested as never before. Field evidence of this devastation poured in from multiple sectors. Reports from the Heiligenbeil corridor detailed units of the Fourth Army trapped against the Frisches Haff, with temperatures plunging below -20°C, turning mud into treacherous ice. Refugee columns attempting to flee were bombarded by artillery and strafed by Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft, resulting in thousands frozen or drowned while crossing the Vistula Lagoon. German diaries, including that of municipal clerk Friedrich Lang, recount families clinging to sleds and carts, their footprints lost in snowdrifts as Soviet fire followed their every movement. Military engineers found that destroyed bridges and mined roads further impeded retreat, creating deadly bottlenecks. This evidence confirmed what Stavka planners had predicted. Rapid Soviet advances combined with environmental hazards could annihilate entire columns. East Prussia was collapsing in real time under the January storm. The broader implications became clear. Within days, the Soviet advance had created an operational trap, isolating Königsberg from resupply and reinforcement, while simultaneously cutting off the German Fourth Army at Heiligenbeil. Intelligence intercepted from the Wehrmacht indicated shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, with frontline hospitals overwhelmed by frostbite and artillery casualties. Comparisons with previous Soviet offensives showed that the East Prussian advance was faster and more devastating than the Leningrad-Novgorod operations in 1944. Strategic assessments indicated that unless Hitler permitted evacuation or flexible defensive withdrawals, entire armies and hundreds of thousands of civilians would be encircled and destroyed. Königsberg's fortress myth once a point of pride, now threatened to become a tomb. The siege conditions were imminent and no relief was in sight. Additional evidence came from German command communications. Hitler's refusal to authorize evacuation of Königsberg, despite warnings from General Otto Lasch, forced both military and civilian populations to remain in place. Field orders issued on January 14th emphasized that the city must hold at all costs, reflecting Hitler's obsession with symbolic defense over practical military necessity. Meanwhile, Red Army reports documented that artillery positions in the Masurian Lakes region could reach targets deep within East Prussia, firing shells up to 80 kilometers and striking with near-precision timing. The combination of frozen terrain, unrelenting firepower, and rigid command created a lethal environment. Soviet planners realized that encirclement could proceed with minimal risk of organized German withdrawal. The operational advantage rested entirely with the attackers. Human consequences mounted with alarming speed. Refugees described blizzards that turned open fields into icy death traps, while children and elderly froze to death within minutes of exposure. In some villages, mass graves were dug hastily in frozen soil, recording casualties numbering in the thousands. Accounts from soldiers describe exhausted men succumbing to frostbite, their weapons abandoned, while artillery shells reduced makeshift shelters to rubble. Municipal records, later recovered by Allied historians, list daily civilian deaths in Königsberg approaching 3,000, with starvation and exposure compounding battlefield casualties. These human details illustrated the operational reality. The fortress could not protect its population, and every hour of resistance increased suffering. Survival was contingent not on walls, but on the impossibility of continued Soviet momentum. By the end of January, Soviet units had advanced nearly 60 kilometers into East Prussia, capturing towns like Stoloponen and Goldap, and effectively isolating Königsberg from the main German forces. The Third Belarusian Front's success had turned the strategic map upside down. What was once considered the core of German defense now appeared vulnerable to total encirclement. For those inside Königsberg, the fortress walls still stood, but the supply lines had vanished. Orders from Hitler forbade withdrawal, and German officers realized that their position could not be reinforced. The city would endure bombardment, starvation, and siege, yet its eventual fall seemed inevitable. The January storm had stripped away illusions of safety and rewritten the operational reality of East Prussia. The next chapter would document the slow tightening of the siege, where the fortress would finally be tested under the weight of modern firepower and human desperation. February 1st, 1945, Pillau Harbor, East Prussia. Soviet naval infantry and artillery units stormed the docks at dawn, capturing the port and severing Königsberg's last connection to the Baltic Sea. Smoke from burning warehouses curled into the frigid air as retreating German sailors scuttled remaining supply vessels, and Stuka dive bombers attempted unsuccessfully to prevent Soviet control. General Otto Lasch, reviewing telegrams from Berlin, realized the fortress city's lifeline was gone. Civilians jammed into surviving buildings and forts, recorded overcrowding of up to 20 people per room, with narrow corridors converted into temporary dormitories. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across multiple fronts, had managed only sporadic supply flights, dropping limited flour, ammunition, and medical kits, often losing 20% of cargo to anti-aircraft fire. Königsberg was isolated. Relief from the sea was no longer possible. Technical reports from Luftwaffe liaison officers reveal the precariousness of the remaining supply chain. By February 3rd, only 7 Ju-89 transport sorties had successfully delivered provisions, averaging 2 tons of flour and 500 kilograms of ammunition per flight. Drop zones were often outside the city walls due to Soviet artillery coverage, requiring improvised manual transport across icy streets, slowing distribution and increasing losses by 30%. German field engineers calculated that the remaining food stockpiles would sustain the population for no more than 35 days at reduced rations of 200 grams of bread per person daily. Compared to the Red Army's logistical efficiency, with railheads supporting 75,000 troops per day at full capacity, Königsberg's situation was untenable. The fortress's isolation was now a technical reality as well as a symbolic one. The contrast between Stalingrad and Königsberg became evident to military planners and observers. Whereas Stalingrad had been encircled due to operational overreach and limited external relief, Königsberg's entrapment resulted from a deliberate Soviet offensive combined with geographic choke points like the Friedrichshafen and Pillau harbor. German defenders, including Volkssturm units composed of teenage boys and men over 50, lacked both mobility and firepower, a stark difference from the experienced Soviet infantry divisions with armored support. Anti-tank and artillery resources were critically low, with only 20 operational Pak-42 guns left to defend over 30 kilometers of perimeter. Soviet reports emphasized that the advance rate remained steady at 6 to 8 kilometers per day, despite winter conditions, highlighting the efficiency gap. The psychological toll on defenders mirrored the technical disadvantages, as morale waned under continuous bombardment and dwindling supplies. Field evidence confirmed the severity of the siege. Reconnaissance patrols reported that Soviet artillery systematically targeted forts, including Forts 8 and 10, designed in the 19th century with walls up to 4 meters thick. Bombardment testing showed repeated direct hits caused structural collapse, unlike Stalingrad, where rubble provided partial cover for defenders. Observers noted that concrete and masonry crumbled under sustained fire from 152 mm and 203 mm howitzers, while air attacks prevented effective repair or reinforcement. German communication logs described delays of several hours in delivering reinforcements to besieged sectors, exacerbating vulnerabilities. Even fortified bunkers proved insufficient against coordinated artillery barrages. Königsberg's defensive ring, once considered invincible, was being methodically dismantled by firepower, not infantry assault. The broader operational implications were grave. With Pillau lost and supply lines severed, the remaining German Fourth Army units faced encirclement in Heiligenbeil, and civilian populations were concentrated inside fortress walls with minimal provisions. Intelligence captured from Soviet interrogations indicated that artillery positions could strike targets across the city every 20 minutes, leaving little time for evacuation or repair. Strategic planners compared this to Stalingrad's encirclement, concluding that without intervention, Königsberg could face complete destruction within weeks. Hitler's insistence on holding the city at all costs left commanders with no options for tactical withdrawal, forcing a rigid static defense. The stage was set for a prolonged siege where both technical fortifications and human endurance would be tested to their limits. The fortress myth collided with the reality of modern warfare. Additional evidence of the siege's pressure came from municipal records and civilian diaries. Population estimates in February 1945 ranged between 550,000 and 600,000, including refugees, many crammed into former warehouses and armory complexes. Heating and sanitation systems had failed, leaving residents to rely on stoves fueled by furniture and firewood scavenged from streets. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, with only 2 functioning hospitals attempting to treat frostbite, malnutrition, and shell injuries. Propaganda loudspeakers, stationed in city squares, broadcast promises of relief from the sea. Though repeated Luftwaffe attempts had failed to restore supply lines, German officers documented daily casualty rates from starvation and cold at nearly 1,000 per day, emphasizing the urgency of defense preparations. Survival depended as much on improvisation as on military discipline. Human consequences deepened under these conditions. Volkssturm units, numbering over 15,000 men, were drilled rapidly in small arms and anti-tank tactics, but lacked coordination and experienced officers. Teenage conscripts, some as young as 15, operated machine guns with minimal training, while elderly men carried outdated Mauser rifles into freezing trenches. Civilians described nights spent in hallways, shivering with only thin blankets, and ration queues lasting hours, sometimes ending without food. The loss of Pillau meant no escape or reinforcements, while Soviet artillery bombardment struck indiscriminately, creating constant anxiety and physical danger. Diaries and letters preserved in the Bundesarchiv recount parents shielding children from collapsing ceilings and gunfire, recording a civilian population caught between command imperatives and survival. The fortress was as much a cage as a defense. By the end of February, Königsberg's situation crystallized into a tense equilibrium. Forts and defensive positions remained, but every structure showed damage. Every supply route was precarious, and every human life was stretched to its limit. Soviet artillery could strike any sector within 20 minutes, while Luftwaffe flights dwindled to one successful sortie every 3 days. Food rations held at 200 grams of bread per person ensured minimal caloric intake. The city's defenders, both military and civilian, realized that endurance alone would not guarantee survival. Hitler's order to hold at all costs transformed the fortress into a test of human endurance, logistics, and improvisation. The siege had tightened, the trap was complete, and the coming chapters would examine the technical intricacies of fortifications and the Soviet assault strategies designed to reduce them systematically. February 5, 1945, Fort 5, Königsberg, East Prussia. German engineers of the 548th Volksgrenadier Division measured frost-cracked concrete walls, while Volkssturm teenagers drilled with Mauser rifles under a pale winter sun. Maps spread across wooden tables detailed the fortress ring, showing 15 major forts with moats ranging from 6 to 8 meters wide, caponniers projecting into defensive ditches, and underground bunkers constructed from 3 meters of reinforced concrete, topped with 6 meters of compacted earth. Ammunition depots, some dating back to World War I, held obsolete 77mm and 105mm shells alongside more modern 150mm rounds, a mixture dictated by supply scarcity and improvisation. Engineers unrolled blueprints from the 1880s, noting the Vauban-style bastions designed to deflect cannon fire while making hurried calculations to accommodate anti-tank positions. The city hummed with quiet industry as both soldiers and civilians improvised to maintain defenses. Every corridor, every embrasure became a potential battleground. Königsberg's defenders were acutely aware that their fortress, though formidable, faced unprecedented modern firepower. Inspection reports highlighted vulnerabilities in the aging fortifications. Wall thickness, averaging 3 meters of concrete reinforced with steel bars, was sufficient against field artillery, but inadequate against Soviet 203mm howitzers capable of firing 125 kilogram shells at velocities exceeding 600 meters per second. Caponniers, while designed to allow crossfire along moats, were too shallow to withstand repeated Katyusha rocket barrages, exposing infantry to lethal shrapnel. Ventilation shafts in bunkers, originally intended for long sieges with coal stoves, became conduits for smoke and debris during bombardments, reducing air quality and troop endurance. Calculations revealed that with continuous shelling, structural integrity would degrade by 20% per week. The engineers' journals preserved in Bundesarchiv document Reichsarchive file KA 345-7 contained meticulous notes on stress points and potential collapse zones. Defensive potential was clear but limited. Königsberg's ring of steel was impressive on paper but perilous in practice. Comparison between Königsberg's Vauban-style forts and Soviet siege capabilities underscored a growing imbalance. Vauban forts relied on geometric angles and interlocking fields of fire to repel infantry assaults, effective against early 20th century artillery, but less so against the Red Army's massed rocket and howitzer units. Soviet 3rd Belarusian Front divisions, supported by 2,500 artillery pieces and armored trains, could concentrate fire on single forts for hours, saturating defenses, where Königsberg offered narrow firing lanes for machine guns and PaK-42 anti-tank guns. Soviet tactics allowed suppression from multiple directions simultaneously. Communication delays within the fortress, often exceeding 30 minutes due to damaged telephone lines, further reduced the defenders' response capacity. The Red Army's numerical superiority and coordinated artillery barrages starkly contrasted with the patchwork German defenses, highlighting that technical ingenuity alone could not compensate for modern offensive power. Human and material constraints magnified these vulnerabilities. Königsberg's engineers faced an operational paradox. Their forts were brilliant in design, but increasingly obsolete against contemporary warfare. Field reports from Fort 10 and Fort 12 confirmed the practical consequences of outdated fortification methods. During a Soviet reconnaissance in force on February 7th, heavy bombardment dislodged sections of concrete parapet, allowing direct fire into inner courtyards. Ammunition stored in WW2-era depots ignited under impact, producing fires that destroyed stored artillery shells and limited defensive output by 25%. Defensive trenches, dug to 2 meters depth and reinforced with wooden beams, partially absorbed small-caliber fire, but offered negligible protection against 152mm rounds. Attempts to deploy reinforcements through snow-blocked avenues proved slow, with soldiers taking over 4 hours to reach threatened sections. Comparisons with Stalingrad's fortifications revealed that modern combined arms assaults rendered traditional bastion layouts vulnerable. Reports emphasized that sustaining a prolonged defense required both improvisation and high human endurance, rather than reliance on structural superiority alone. The siege was already a test of both engineering and human resolve. Broader operational implications emerged from detailed analyses of Königsberg's defensive ring. Soviet artillery targeting plans demonstrated that each fort could be neutralized sequentially, exploiting overlapping fields of fire and weak junctions. Engineers noted that moats and earthworks, while preventing rapid infantry advances, did little to impede artillery barrages or rocket salvos. Reinforcement strategies relying on interior roads were constrained by snow, ice, and ongoing bombardment, reducing troop mobility by 50%. These factors made a prolonged defense dependent on rationing and the psychological resilience of both soldiers and civilians. Operational planners began to acknowledge that without external support, Königsberg could be reduced fort by fort. Hitler's insistence on holding the city complicated any adaptive strategy, forcing defenders to work within rigid directives while balancing human endurance with technical limitations. The stage was set for an attritional battle where modern firepower would challenge centuries-old engineering. Additional evidence reinforced the limits of the fortress against modern weaponry. Luftwaffe supply reports indicated that only 5% of requested ammunition and rations reached frontline forts due to anti-aircraft fire and inclement weather. Observations from the 548th Volksgrenadier Division highlighted that interior fort structures, some built over 50 meters below ground, were vulnerable to artillery concussive shock, causing collapses in roof beams and internal walls. Civilian diaries noted that abandoned barracks and warehouses were pressed into service as temporary barracks, often located in blind spots of fort fire lanes, creating dangerous bottlenecks. Radio communications documented that Soviet intelligence had already mapped critical points in Forts 6 and 9, preparing pre-registered fire zones. Compared to Soviet engineering, capable of mobile bridging and direct fire adaptation, German methods were static and vulnerable. The combination of outdated munitions, structural fragility, and limited manpower left the defenders at a precarious advantage. Königsberg's ring of steel was impressive but brittle. Human and operational consequences manifested daily within the forts. Teenagers of the Volkssturm, often untrained and poorly clothed for winter operations, were stationed at exposed caponiers with minimal cover. Veteran fortress troops attempted to train them in firing techniques and emergency protocols, but psychological strain was immediate and visible. Ammunition shortages forced soldiers to ration shells, firing only when targets were confirmed, while improvised barricades became essential to slow Soviet probes. Civilian laborers, numbering in the thousands, reinforced walls with sandbags and timber, often under indirect artillery fire, sustaining injuries without medical care. Field reports recorded that over 50% of fort garrisons suffered frostbite or exhaustion during the first week of February. Every hour of defense demanded ingenuity, endurance, and courage. The human element had become the decisive factor in sustaining Königsberg's fortifications. By mid-February, Königsberg's defenders faced a sobering realization. Forts remained physically imposing, with walls 3 meters thick and earthworks 6 meters deep, but continuous bombardment had created vulnerabilities across every sector. Ammunition stocks were depleted, communications hampered, and civilian populations strained to their limits. Engineers concluded that static fortifications could no longer guarantee operational success against coordinated Soviet firepower, and improvised measures, from barricades to emergency shelters, were necessary for survival. The fortress's design brilliance, rooted in Vauban principles and 19th century calculations, collided with 20th century technological realities. Every defensive measure required human augmentation to remain viable. The coming chapters would examine Soviet technical planning and the weapons specifically designed to reduce these fortresses to rubble, testing both engineering and human resolve. January 17, 1945, Gumbinnen Plains, East Prussia. Soviet artillery officers of the 3rd Belarusian Front oversaw the deployment of 152 mm and 203 mm cannons onto frozen fields, their steel wheels crunching over ice and snow, while tractor convoys brought forward ammunition stockpiles of 25,000 shells each. Engineers unrolled field manuals, codified in 1943 under Red Army Fortress Reduction Guidelines, detailing methods for breaching reinforced concrete with direct and plunging fire. Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, numbering 1,400, were aligned in batteries of 40 launchers each, calibrated to saturate designated sectors of Königsberg's 15 forts. Su-152 self-propelled assault guns, nicknamed Beast Killers, were positioned for urban operations with their 72-ton hulls capable of delivering 150mm shells into fortified structures. Recon reports noted that pre-registered fire coordinates covered every major bastion, and engineers began placing mines beneath moats and fortifications for demolition once breaches were initiated. Smoke from diesel engines mixed with the winter fog, obscuring movement, while officers confirmed firing angles with protractors accurate to a single degree. The stage was set for an overwhelming application of combined firepower. Technical examination revealed the destructive capacity of Soviet siege assets. The 152mm howitzer M10 could project 160kg shells to a range of 17 kilometers, while the 203mm B4 howitzer delivered shells of 125 kilograms at 21 kilometers, with blast overpressure capable of cracking 3 meters of reinforced concrete. Katyusha rockets, though less precise, saturated entire defensive sectors in seconds, creating shockwaves that dislodged masonry and caused secondary detonations in stored ammunition. Su-152S, mounting 72-ton chassis with 150mm ZS-152 guns, could obliterate bastion walls with a single salvo, rendering previously impenetrable forts vulnerable. Engineers compared these systems to German fortress artillery, where 105mm and 150mm emplacements offered limited range and slow rates of fire. Field diagrams in operational reports, including Document Central Archive RGVA file 452311, charted optimal impact zones for maximum structural compromise. Each technical capability translated into practical battlefield dominance. Königsberg's defenders faced a weaponry imbalance, unlike any previous encounter. Comparative analysis of opposing systems highlighted stark contrasts. Vauban-style forts, designed to absorb and deflect early 20th century field artillery, lacked structural redundancy against concentrated Soviet bombardments. German fortress guns had a maximum effective range of 6 kilometers, with crews exposed to counter-battery fire and minimal protective shielding. Soviet systems, conversely, could operate from 10 to 20 kilometers away, coordinating fire between multiple calibers for cumulative effect. Where German emplacements relied on rigid firing sectors, Soviet artillery utilized flexible trajectory calculations, allowing suppression and neutralization of flanking positions. Observation posts and aerial reconnaissance enabled rapid adjustment, whereas Königsberg's internal communications suffered from intermittent lines and blocked signal paths. The operational consequence was clear. German static defenses could no longer dictate engagement terms. Every technical advantage resided with the Red Army. Field evidence confirmed the anticipated destruction patterns. On January 19th, coordinated barrages from Battery 72 reduced sections of Fort 3's caponiers to rubble, while mine demolition teams exploited weakened earthworks. Observers reported that over 50% of roof beams in Fort 7 cracked under continuous 203mm shelling, causing secondary collapses and casualties among defenders. Katyusha salvos at dusk on January 20th produced shockwaves that shattered windows across Königsberg, temporarily blinding machine gunners and disrupting defensive coordination. EU-152 strikes on Fort 12 penetrated 3 meters of concrete and ignited stored ammunition, reducing available artillery output by 30%. Casualty reports indicated that over 100 defenders per fort were incapacitated per week under sustained bombardment. Engineers documented these failures meticulously, noting structural weaknesses to inform subsequent operational planning. Königsberg's defensive integrity was rapidly eroding. Broader operational implications became evident as artillery fire continued. Soviet engineers calculated that sequential neutralization of forts would allow the Third Belarusian Front to concentrate forces for assault without encountering organized resistance. Civilian shelters and underground tunnels, while offering temporary protection, were susceptible to overpressure from nearby detonations, causing structural collapses and panic. Comparisons with Sevastopol in 1942 revealed that simultaneous artillery and engineering assaults could reduce even the most robust fortifications within weeks. Strategic intelligence highlighted the inadequacy of Königsberg's supply chains. Luftwaffe attempts to resupply were increasingly intercepted or impeded by weather and anti-aircraft fire. Soviet staff mapped every sector for overlapping trajectories, minimizing blind spots. The operational picture indicated that technical superiority, coupled with precise planning, could determine the siege outcome. Königsberg's defenders faced attrition on multiple fronts simultaneously. Additional supporting evidence reinforced the lethal coordination of Soviet firepower. Mortar regiments equipped with 120mm and 160mm weapons provided close support, firing high explosive rounds into breached sectors to suppress counterattacks. Engineers documented mine-laying operations beneath Fort 9's moats, intended to collapse walls once preliminary breaches occurred. Reconnaissance indicated that pre-registered artillery barrages had already neutralized outer observation points, impairing German counter-battery capabilities. Coordination between rocket and gun batteries allowed saturation rates exceeding 150 shells per minute over selected targets. Soviet field manuals emphasized combining direct fire vehicles with indirect artillery to maximize fort reduction efficiency. Every technical measure contributed to a comprehensive siege doctrine, leaving defenders with minimal adaptive options. Königsberg's fortifications were under unprecedented pressure from modern engineering and firepower. Human and operational consequences manifested across the siege zone. Infantry units operating near bombardments experienced constant concussive trauma, while artillery crews endured temperatures below -10 degrees Celsius during sustained firing rotations. Civilian populations in underground shelters faced suffocation, hazards, and food shortages, exacerbated by the destruction of supply caches. Defensive units attempted to maintain morale, but repeated Su-152 strikes on bunkers caused confusion and forced rotations of garrison personnel. Casualty estimates from February 1st indicated that 1,000 civilians and over 500 soldiers were incapacitated or killed due to combined artillery and structural collapse. Commanders adjusted tactics continually, but the overwhelming firepower limited operational flexibility. Every engagement reflected the human cost of technical dominance. By early February, Königsberg's defenders understood the scale of the challenge. Continuous bombardment from over 5,000 artillery pieces and 1,400 Katyusha launchers had compromised multiple forts, while engineers continued to prepare mines for final demolition. Su-152 assault vehicles awaited orders to penetrate urban sectors, ensuring that remaining strongpoints could be neutralized rapidly. Soviet observation posts documented internal movement, allowing coordinated strikes and minimal exposure for advancing units. Comparisons with Sevastopol's reduction in 1942 confirmed that sequential overlapping attacks would render the fortress ineffective within weeks. The balance of firepower had decisively shifted. Königsberg's technical defenses were insufficient against the Red Army's methodical artillery doctrine. Soviet command began preparing for the final operational phase, translating artillery dominance into urban assault plans. Engineers mapped interior streets for Su-152 and infantry maneuvers, while artillery officers calculated counter-battery suppression to protect advancing formations. Placed beneath outer bastions were ready for detonation to create entry points into previously impregnable forts. Coordination with Katyusha batteries ensured simultaneous saturation of all major defensive sectors, maximizing shock and structural damage. Reports emphasized continuous fire to prevent defenders from regrouping or repairing breaches. Every measure was designed to exploit technical superiority, leaving Königsberg's garrison with minimal options. The siege was no longer a battle of endurance but of technological inevitability. The next phase would translate artillery dominance into physical conquest of the fortress city. January 20th, 1945, Königsberg, Command Bunker, Königsberg. General Otto Lasch, uniform dusted with snow from inspection rounds, cradled a portable radio while Hitler's voice crackled through, ordering hold at all costs, no surrender, each word punctuated by static that masked desperation. Lasch's desk was strewn with ration reports, diary entries, and maps of the city's 15 forts, detailing fortification thicknesses up to 3 meters of reinforced concrete and earth embankments reaching 6 meters. His diary, dated January 19th, recorded bread rations falling to 200 grams per day, horse meat soup replacing protein sources, and ammunition stockpiles dwindling dangerously. Officers of the 548th Volksgrenadier Division reported that Volkssturm recruits, predominantly 14 to 60-year-olds, were incapable of handling standard-issue carabiner 98K rifles, misfiring 1 in every 5 attempts. Observation posts on the city outskirts noted Soviet artillery patterns, with 152mm shells impacting perimeters at intervals of 30 seconds, each strike shaking plaster from ceilings. Lasch paused to read Hitler's fortress decree, transmitted via coded teletype, a document insisting on unwavering defense regardless of human cost. The room was tense. Every decision weighed life against obedience. Lasch's technical assessments of defensive capacity revealed troubling realities. Fortifications dating from the 1880s, designed using German engineer Carl Friedrich von Giese's blueprints, included moats, caponiers, and interconnected tunnels, but lacked reinforced steel mesh and modern blast-resistant materials. Ammunition stored in magazines consisted partly of obsolete World War I shells, their fuses prone to misfire, while artillery emplacements, 105mm and 150mm guns, suffered from limited traverse and elevation rates, reducing responsiveness against Soviet long-range barrages. Communication cables frequently froze during sub-zero nights, impairing coordinated counter-battery fire. Lasch's engineers calculated that repeated impacts from 203mm shells or Katyusha salvos would fracture masonry and collapse parapets within days. Compared to modern Red Army artillery, the defensive systems were structurally sound but tactically obsolete. The consequences were immediate. Forts could resist infantry assaults, but were vulnerable to concentrated indirect fire. Every technical calculation amplified the looming human crisis. Comparisons with past German disasters weighed heavily on Lasch. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943 illustrated the cost of rigid obedience to Hitler's no-surrender directives, where over 90,000 men were captured or killed. Paulus had clung to orders despite encirclement, exhausting limited supplies and destroying morale. Lasch, a pragmatic World War I veteran, respected for frontline command in Flanders and Verdun, understood the peril of repeating history in Königsberg, Soviet numerical superiority, over 2 million troops poised for the East Prussian offensive, rendered German fortifications nearly irrelevant. Where Paulus had faced the Sixth Army's confinement, Lasch confronted a city crammed with 200,000 refugees in addition to regular troops. The operational stakes were clear. Strict adherence to Hitler's directives risked total annihilation. Morale and human survival hung in the balance. Field reports from January 21st reinforced the critical situation. Volkssturm units assigned to Fort 6 misfired 80% of standard volleys during live-fire exercises, while reports from Fort 10 indicated frozen ammunition magazines, where shells had developed hairline fractures after repeated exposure to sub-zero storage. Food distribution centers documented daily ration consumption dropping to 170 grams for children and elderly, with horse meat supplementing protein. Radio intercepts confirmed increased Soviet artillery accuracy, with targeting data derived from forward observers and aerial reconnaissance. Urban streets were clogged with displaced civilians, many of whom had abandoned transport sleds due to ice breaking under weight. Casualty estimates rose to over 300 civilians per day due to exposure, starvation, and stray shelling. Lasch staff convened secret meetings in reinforced basements, debating evacuation routes or last resort counterattacks. Evidence indicated that time favored the attacker, not the garrison. The broader implications crystallized during these discussions. Each fort's inability to withstand combined artillery, rocket, and sapper assaults meant that the city's perimeter could collapse sequentially, creating gaps exploitable by Soviet infantry. Comparisons with Stalingrad highlighted that encirclement amplified resource shortages, psychological strain, and command dilemmas. Communications with Army Group Center were sporadic at best, with cable breaks and disrupted courier routes preventing coordination. Lasch's diary noted concern for civilians jammed 20 per room in fortified shelters, with insufficient water, blankets, or medical supplies. A systematic collapse of supply lines combined with relentless bombardment threatened to convert Königsberg into a trapped urban cauldron. Operational planning required balancing tactical stubbornness with humanitarian urgency. Every consideration emphasized the narrowing window for decision-making. Additional supporting evidence arrived from reconnaissance and intercepted messages. Luftwaffe flights attempting to airdrop flour and ammunition faced Soviet anti-aircraft fire and icy runway conditions, limiting success to 25% of planned sorties. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet sappers were drilling tunnels to place mines beneath forts, an engineering method tested in the reduction of Sevastopol in 1942. Reports from the 548th Volksgrenadier Division indicated that morale among teenagers and elderly militia was deteriorating, with desertion attempts rising to 5% per day. Hitler's radio communications, repeated on January 22, reiterated uncompromising orders, threatening court-martial for any commander permitting retreat or surrender. Document WAR Arch 1945-19 detailed these directives, emphasizing fortress status at all costs. Lasch recognized that obedience would exacerbate human suffering. Every incoming report amplified his moral dilemma. Human and operational consequences were mounting visibly. Soldiers suffered frostbite during guard rotations, civilians collapsed in corridors due to hunger, and horse meat rations induced gastrointestinal illness among the elderly. Fortifications, though physically intact in sections, offered no practical relief against systematic artillery targeting, leaving defenders and non-combatants equally exposed. Lasch personally inspected Fort 12 on January 23, noting broken parapets, frozen weapons, and demoralized teenage Volkssturm recruits unable to hold their assigned sectors. Casualty figures suggested that within the next week, 2,000 more civilians could perish under harsh winter conditions and bombardment. Command decisions were constrained between complying with Hitler's fortress decree and mitigating preventable deaths. Every choice carried lethal weight. By late January, Lach confronted the unavoidable conflict between orders and reality. Diary entries reflected sleepless nights and mounting stress, documenting rations, structural integrity, and human casualties with meticulous detail. Comparisons with Stalingrad remained in his mind, where rigid compliance had led to catastrophic loss. His staff debated creating breakout corridors or negotiating local truces, yet Hitler's radio messages forbade any compromise. Engineering assessments showed that forts could no longer resist combined artillery and sapper attacks for more than days, not weeks. The city's collapse seemed inevitable without intervention. Lach faced an existential decision: obey commands or preserve life. The tension defined every waking hour. As January closed, Lach's dilemma crystallized the human dimension of Königsberg's siege. Orders from Berlin remained inflexible. Supplies and reinforcements were insufficient, and civilian suffering escalated with each passing day. Every technical report, casualty estimate, and ration calculation underscored the unsustainability of prolonged resistance. The parallel with Paulus at Stalingrad weighed heavily. Adherence to a no-surrender mandate could destroy both army and populace. Yet, Lach's pragmatism and frontline experience demanded acknowledgement of reality. The city teetered between defiance and survival, with the garrison's fate intertwined with thousands of civilians. The next chapter would explore how this moral and operational tension shaped the final decisions. Choices in Königsberg were no longer abstract. They were matters of life and death. March 1st, 1945, Samland Peninsula, East Prussia. Soviet scouts of the 11th Guards Army crossed frozen marshes and narrow causeways, their skis crunching on ice, as observation binoculars traced Königsberg's skyline through intermittent snow flurries. The peninsula's capture severed the last overland supply route, isolating the city from reinforcements or retreat. Reconnaissance reports detailed German fortifications from fort, highlighting moats up to 6 meters wide and reinforced concrete walls of 3 meters, yet noting gaps between forts where Soviet engineers planned future sapper infiltration. Luftwaffe sorties attempting resupply had dwindled to 10 tons of flour and ammunition per day, barely sufficient for the remaining garrison of 75,000 soldiers and over 100,000 civilians. Daily rationing allowed only 2 to 3 shells per gun for the fortress artillery, severely limiting counter-battery options. Forward units of the 11th Guards monitored signals intelligence, intercepting coded radio messages, reporting failed German counterattacks outside the walls. The stage was set, Königsberg was encircled, and destruction loomed. Technical analysis by Soviet artillery officers revealed precise vulnerabilities in Königsberg's defenses. Field photographs from aerial reconnaissance on February 27th showed rooftops riddled with shell fragments, streets obstructed by debris, and artillery emplacements partially immobilized by frozen terrain. Soviet sappers mapped routes beneath Fort 5 and Fort 9, calculating load-bearing capacities for explosives capable of breaching 3-meter-thick concrete walls. Katyusha launchers stationed 2 kilometers from city limits could deliver saturation barrages of 72 132mm rockets within 42 seconds, creating shockwaves exceeding 500 pascals over reinforced structures. In contrast, the German 105mm fortress guns could fire only 15 rounds per hour under freezing conditions. The practical consequence, sustained bombardment would compromise fort integrity before defenders could react. Documentation from the Third Belarusian Front archives confirmed these calculations, citing Fort 7 as a primary target for early demolition. The combination of reconnaissance, engineering, and artillery precision ensured minimal Soviet uncertainty. Comparisons with prior sieges underscored Soviet efficiency. Unlike Leningrad, which endured 2,600 days of blockade from September 1941 to January 1944, Königsberg's isolation promised collapse within weeks. German defensive philosophy relied on layered static fortifications, emphasizing interior courtyards, caponiers, and interconnected tunnels, effective against infantry assaults, but vulnerable to concentrated long-range artillery. Soviet doctrine, refined during Sevastopol 1942, prioritized multi-pronged artillery barrages, rocket saturation, and sapper-engineered breaches, whereas Leningrad required attritional starvation and protracted siege tactics. Königsberg faced the immediate consequences of combined arms precision. Operational advantage favored the Red Army unequivocally. The German garrison's limitations, low ammunition, frozen mobility, and civilian congestion, amplified this disparity. Each comparison magnified the inevitability of decisive Soviet action. Field observations confirmed Soviet expectations. On March 3, air raids flattened industrial districts in northern Königsberg, reducing warehouses to twisted steel and splintered brick, while artillery fire systematically silenced German observation posts. Counterattacks by the Fourth Army remnants outside the city were annihilated in open fields, with surviving units retreating toward Fort 11. Forward observers reported that German resistance along the city perimeter required only minimal direct engagement. Artillery shock and precise rocket targeting achieved disruption before infantry reached defensive lines. Casualty estimates exceeded 1,000 in 24 hours, including soldiers and civilians trapped in exposed districts. Reconnaissance drones documented destroyed supply depots, further limiting defensive capabilities. Each strike reinforced the operational thesis. The city's collapse was imminent. Morale among the garrison and refugees deteriorated rapidly, mirrored by increased desertion attempts. Broader implications became evident in strategic assessments. Königsberg's encirclement mirrored a microcosm of East Prussia's broader collapse, with Soviet forces occupying surrounding villages and blocking retreat corridors. Supply chains were fully severed, with only minimal Luftwaffe drops maintaining essential rations. Artillery concentration charts showed that each fort's sectors could be neutralized sequentially, preventing mutual support and isolating command centers. Observers noted that civilian shelters housed upwards of 25 individuals per room, straining sanitation and medical care. Commanders calculated that the city could not withstand combined artillery, air, and sapper attacks beyond 4 to 6 weeks. Strategic planning emphasized speed over prolonged attrition. Every technical assessment reinforced the short timeline for total capture. Additional intelligence reinforced the gravity of the situation. Air photographs captured on March 5 revealed sappers tunneling under Fort 4 and Fort 8, laying 600 kilograms of explosive charges at structural weak points. Intercepted German communications confirmed that artillery ammunition per emplacement had dropped to a maximum of 3 rounds per gun per day, critically limiting counter-battery capacity. Reports from Luftwaffe liaison officers indicated that adverse weather conditions further restricted sorties, reducing potential resupply by 50% from prior weeks. Forward elements of the 11th Guards Army positioned Su-152 assault vehicles at breach points, prepared to exploit gaps in fortifications once detonations occurred. Soviet field manuals for fortress reduction, drawing lessons from Sevastopol, prescribed combined use of artillery, engineers and mechanized infantry to minimize casualties and accelerate collapse. The operational picture was complete. Königsberg's defenders faced overwhelming odds. Human and operational consequences were mounting tangibly. Civilians huddled in basement shelters reported frostbite, starvation, and panic as artillery impacts shattered walls. Soldiers attempted to ration limited ammunition, firing only upon confirmed targets, while logistical officers tracked falling supplies with grim accuracy. Refugees blocked streets, hindering troop movements and further complicating defensive coordination. Casualty figures rose to 3,000 within the first week of encirclement, with estimates predicting doubling in subsequent days if bombardment continued. Morale eroded visibly, with some Volkssturm units abandoning posts, leaving gaps in fort coverage. Each failed countermeasure, combined with relentless Soviet firepower, underscored the inevitability of urban collapse. The human cost was accelerating daily. By mid-March, operational patterns indicated final encirclement was effectively complete. Samland Peninsula occupation denied any German retreat. Luftwaffe sorties were reduced to less than 10 tons daily, and ammunition stockpiles were insufficient for sustained defense. Soviet air reconnaissance confirmed destroyed supply routes, flattened industrial sectors, and breaches in peripheral fortifications. Comparisons to Leningrad reinforced the accelerated timeline. Königsberg would not endure years of siege, but only weeks. Commanders in the 11th Guards Army anticipated the final breach would come within 20 days, assuming continued artillery saturation and targeted sapper operations. The Red Army's coordination of artillery, rockets, engineers, and infantry had transformed a formidable fortress into a temporary obstacle. Planning for April's final offensive was already underway. As March closed, Königsberg's fate was sealed. Encirclement was total. German counterattacks outside the city had failed, and air raids had reduced multiple districts to rubble. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were critically low, and civilian suffering escalated with each passing day. Soviet commanders consolidated artillery positions and coordinated Katyusha barrages to isolate remaining forts sequentially. Intelligence assessments from March 12 projected that total collapse could occur within weeks. With operational focus shifting to final reduction strategies, the Red Army's methodical approach ensured minimal uncertainty and maximum effect. Königsberg was poised on the brink, and the next chapter would detail the concentrated Soviet assault that would bring the fortress to its knees. The encirclement was not merely a tactical maneuver, it was the prelude to complete annihilation. April 5, 1945. Znamenskoye Artillery Staging Ground, East Prussia. Marshal Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky stepped from his staff car, boots crunching on frozen earth, as forward observers pointed toward Königsberg's silhouette 3 kilometers distant, its forts stark against a grey sky. Staff officers unfurled large-scale maps annotated in red ink, showing artillery placements for 5,000 guns, including 120 152mm howitzers and 72 Katyusha rocket launchers. Troop allocations were precise. 137,000 soldiers of the 11th Guards, 5th and 28th Armies were assigned to the main assault sectors, supported by sapper battalions and ECU 152 assault vehicles ready for fortress reduction. Leaflets were prepared en masse, promising fair treatment for surrendered civilians and garrison troops. A psychological operation coordinated by the 3rd Belarusian Front's political officers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirmed German positions, while intercepted communications indicated rations limited to 2 to 3 shells per gun daily. Vasilevsky noted the timing, April 6th to 9th, a 3-day concentrated offensive, intended to replicate and refine tactics later to be applied in Berlin. Planning was exacting, failure was not an option. Technical analysis dominated the morning briefings. Engineers calculated blast effects for 600 kilogram charges to be emplaced beneath Fort 4 and Fort 10, with seismic waves sufficient to compromise walls up to 3 meters thick and adjacent earth embankments 6 meters high. Artillery officers cross-referenced these figures with ballistic tables, confirming that each 203 mm gun firing high explosive shells at a 45-degree elevation would penetrate reinforced structures at ranges of 3,000 meters. Katyusha launchers were sited to deliver saturation barrages with 72 rockets per salvo, each producing explosive energy equivalent to 400 kilograms of TNT. The practical consequence, overlapping artillery zones, ensured no fort could be reinforced or repaired between strikes. Field manuals from the Soviet Central Archives, labeled Document F-76-1945, codified these calculations and prescribed simultaneous combined arms employment. The preparations mirrored a rehearsal, demonstrating meticulous scientific planning before human action. Commanders tracked every metric, ensuring predictable destruction. Comparisons with prior operations highlighted Soviet refinement. Unlike Stalingrad in 1942, where encirclement depended on attrition over months, Königsberg's reduction relied on concentrated firepower over days. Sevastopol, 1942, had required simultaneous naval, air, and land bombardment to breach fortifications, yet lacked the logistical density of the 5,200 artillery pieces now massed. German defensive philosophy emphasized permanent fortifications with moats, caponiers, and interlocking fields of fire, effective against infantry, but vulnerable to combined arms and continuous bombardment. Soviet tactics prioritized the integration of artillery, rockets, sappers, and mechanized infantry, ensuring immediate exploitation of breaches. The contrast was stark. German walls designed for static defense, Soviet firepower designed for rapid annihilation. Each comparison underscored that Königsberg's fate depended on overwhelming concentration of force rather than attritional siege. Field observations confirmed operational hypotheses. On April 6, aerial reconnaissance captured plumes of smoke rising from northern Fort 9 after an initial artillery salvo, while sappers advanced under cover of barrages to plant explosives beneath bastions. Forward observers reported that overlapping fields of fire prevented German counter-battery response, as only 2 to 3 shells per gun were available. Su-152 vehicles, codenamed Beast Killers in reports, destroyed reinforced pillboxes within 90 seconds of arrival, demonstrating the effectiveness of mechanized assault integration. Casualty figures among German defenders were preliminary but exceeded 500 in 12 hours of bombardment. Leaflet drops indicated political officers monitored civilian morale, noting an increase in surrenders after initial strikes. Each observation validated the Soviet operational model. Speed and precision would dictate success. Field evidence demonstrated that technical superiority translated directly into tactical advantage. Broader implications were clear as Vasilevsky inspected artillery positions. Königsberg served as a proving ground for methods intended for Berlin, allowing the Red Army to calibrate massed firepower coordination, engineer tunneling techniques, and psychological operations. Supply lines had been calculated to maintain continuous shell fire for 72 hours, with forward ammunition depots secured within 2 kilometers of assault points. Sapper battalions were rehearsing demolition sequences to ensure simultaneous wall breaches across multiple forts. Radio intercepts confirmed that German attempts to move reinforcements or evacuate civilians were impossible. Civilian shelters were densely packed, over 25 per room in some districts, creating secondary consequences for artillery targeting and psychological operations. Operational planning extended beyond destruction. It encompassed timing, human management, and tactical exploitation. The stakes were high and measurable. Additional evidence reinforced preparations. Intercepted German orders noted food rations down to horsemeat soup, and ammunition shortages limited artillery response to sectors under direct assault. Luftwaffe sorties provided negligible resupply, only 10 tons per day, insufficient to sustain defensive endurance. Soviet engineers consulting document F-76 1945 modeled the collapse of walls under combined charges and artillery fire, predicting breaches within 24 to 36 hours of sustained bombardment. Political officers drafted leaflets guaranteeing humane treatment to encourage surrender and minimize unnecessary destruction, integrating psychological operations with kinetic planning. Each element, from engineering calculations to troop concentration, was layered to reduce uncertainty. Intelligence indicated that the German command had no viable countermeasure. Operational readiness was at its peak. Human and operational consequences were apparent. Soldiers rehearsed movements under simulated fire, observing calculated shockwave effects from mock charges. Forward observers noted civilian populations moving away from streets exposed to the bombardment, creating logistical bottlenecks for defenders. Morale among German troops was visibly declining, as political leaflets reached garrison interiors, promising survival if resistance ceased. Commanders recorded these reactions, adjusting assault timing to exploit psychological as well as physical vulnerabilities. Casualties among defenders were projected to increase sharply after initial artillery and rocket salvos. The orchestration of human behavior became a tactical variable, not just collateral. Soviet planning transformed both battlefield and population into integrated operational considerations. Anticipated outcomes were methodically engineered. By April 7th, final assault preparations were complete. Artillery lines were synchronized, sappers positioned, Katyusha batteries calibrated, and leaflets distributed across urban zones. Comparisons with Berlin planning emphasized that Königsberg served as both test and rehearsal for large-scale fortress reduction. Continuous observation and detailed intelligence ensured every unit knew exact firing arcs, supply requirements, breach schedules. Forward reports noted that German defenses could no longer be reinforced or resupplied effectively. Operational simulations suggested total collapse within 3 days. If execution proceeded according to plan, the Red Army was ready to convert months of calculation into action. Offensive's initiation would decide the speed and completeness of the city's fall. As April 8th approached, the countdown to destruction had begun. Soviet artillery officers monitored last-minute adjustments, ensuring overlapping fire zones and synchronized rocket barrages. Marshal Vasilevsky reviewed the operation timetable, confirming that the main assault would commence at 0600 hours on April 6th and continue uninterrupted for 72 hours. Political officers ensured that propaganda measures were aligned with kinetic operations. Intelligence confirmed that German garrison morale was fractured, ammunition limited, and civilian populations exposed. Every measurement, observation, and document pointed toward a rapid collapse. Königsberg's fate rested on meticulous planning, precise execution, and overwhelming force. The next chapter would recount the first hours of the assault, where strategy transformed into relentless urban combat. April 6, 1945. Northern banks of the Pregel River, Königsberg. The first shells of the 11th Guards Army fell at precisely 0900 hours, 500,000 rounds, raining over 72 hours, with an intensity unmatched in the Baltic theatre. Smoke rose from the Altstar as multi-story timber and masonry buildings ignited, streets became molten channels of fire, and civilian shelters, often 3 stories below street level, filled with choking smoke. Forward observers noted Su-152 assault guns, battering forts 1 through 4, each shell producing concussions that reverberated through the frozen earth, undermining walls built to withstand 3 meters of reinforced concrete. The operation was timed to coincide with leaflets promising fair treatment for civilians and garrison troops, a psychological adjunct to kinetic destruction. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had already confirmed that German defensive positions were overextended, and counterattacks outside city walls had been decisively neutralized. Soviet engineers documented collapse patterns, recording structural failures for post-operation analysis. The firestorm had begun, and Königsberg's reality was about to change. Technical observation revealed the mechanics of destruction. Each 203mm howitzer fired shells weighing 128 kilograms, achieving a muzzle velocity of 760 meters per second, capable of penetrating reinforced bunkers and earthworks 6 meters thick. Katyusha rocket barrages delivered 72 rocket salvos over 2-minute intervals, saturating defensive sectors with high explosive ordnance equivalent to 250 kilograms of TNT per volley. Su-152 assault guns, powered by a 600 horsepower engine, deployed high explosive rounds against fortified gates, proving capable of demolishing structures that German engineers had designed to withstand traditional artillery. Explosions triggered secondary fires, especially in timber buildings and ammunition depots, compounding physical destruction. Field manuals from the 3rd Belarusian Front, archived in document KA 1945-3, codified these firing sequences and target priorities. The technical synergy of artillery, rockets, and assault vehicles ensured maximal operational effect. The practical outcome: no fort or urban sector could withstand sustained impact without immediate collapse. Comparative analysis underscored the effectiveness of Soviet methodology. Unlike Sevastopol in 1942, which required months of protracted siege with naval bombardment, Königsberg faced concentrated bombardment over days. German fortifications, designed according to Vauban principles with moats, caponiers, and interlocking bastions, were formidable against infantry but vulnerable to overlapping kinetic effects. Whereas Stalingrad relied on attritional encirclement to sap morale, Königsberg was subjected to deliberate psychological and structural targeting from the outset. Soviet strategy integrated explosive force, terrain exploitation, and population management, contrasting sharply with German doctrines prioritizing static resistance. Consequences were immediate: morale plummeted, defensive cohesion eroded, and civilian panic became operationally significant. The difference in approach highlighted the evolution of combined arms doctrine between 1942 and 1945. Königsberg was a crucible testing these principles under intense fire. Field reports confirmed catastrophic results. Forward observers in the Altstadt reported 50% destruction of residential blocks within 6 hours, with fires consuming 500 tons of timber and masonry. Su-152 assault guns breached Fort II's northern wall within 90 minutes. as sappers detonated pre-positioned explosives beneath bastions. Ammunition rationing limited German artillery to 2 to 3 shells per gun per day, insufficient to counter saturation bombardments. Civilians were trapped in smoke-filled shelters, some succumbing to asphyxiation, as documented in Soviet war diaries of the 11th Guards Army, codified in document PW47 1945. Street intersections became obstacles of smoldering debris, slowing any attempts at organized counterattack. The operational picture confirmed that the preparatory bombardment had achieved both physical and psychological dominance. Troop reports indicated German units were disoriented and reactive rather than proactive. Field evidence validated technical calculations. Broader implications emerged as engineers analyzed the Pregels' urban devastation. Firestorms created secondary shock waves, igniting munitions depots and collapsing adjacent structures. Soviet observers noted that overlapping fields of fire disrupted German command and control, forcing local commanders to improvise under extreme duress. The destruction also facilitated planned infantry advances. Breaches in walls and roofs allowed Su-152s and infantry squads to exploit vertical and horizontal avenues. Civilian casualties, while tragic, inadvertently revealed vulnerabilities in shelter construction and ventilation. Tactical coordination ensured that no area remained safe for defenders, with artillery, rockets, and engineers systematically neutralizing all threats. Königsberg became a laboratory of urban destruction, demonstrating principles that would later be applied in Berlin. Every operational choice had cascading consequences. Additional supporting evidence reinforced these findings. Air reconnaissance confirmed that smoke and fire obscured key intersections, forcing German units into choke points where Soviet infantry awaited. Mortar regiments positioned on elevated terrain delivered sustained indirect fire against any visible counterattacking units. Forward intelligence noted that bridges over the Pregel were already weakened, complicating German troop movement and supply. Cu-152 assault guns exploited these breaches, their 152mm shells cracking concrete walls designed to absorb conventional artillery. Civilian panic further degraded defensive capacity as untrained Volkssturm militiamen struggled to organize while evacuation routes were blocked. Psychological operations proved as effective as physical bombardment. Evidence confirmed that technical superiority directly translated into operational advantage. Human consequences were immediate and devastating. Residents documented in diaries the collapse of Altstadt blocks, the roar of shellfire, and the stench of smoke and molten debris. Soldiers experienced disorientation and shock, often abandoning positions once bastions failed. Supply lines within the city crumbled, with rations and ammunition inaccessible to frontline troops. Civilian sheltering failed under conditions of heat, smoke, and debris, with shelters in Fort 1 and Fort 3 reaching double capacity. The integrated impact of artillery, rockets, and assault guns reshaped both human and material landscapes. German morale, already fragile, began a precipitous decline. Each sector's collapse produced both tactical openings and operational dilemmas for the defenders. The firestorm was a physical and psychological weapon simultaneously. By late afternoon, Soviet units reported that Forts 1 and 2 had sustained breaches of 3 to 5 meters in walls, and that fires consumed entire streets, creating corridors for infantry exploitation. Coordination between infantry and Su-152 units allowed immediate penetration of previously inaccessible sections. Civilian chaos was documented in war diaries as a key factor in operational planning, with planners adjusting artillery targeting to avoid unnecessary casualties in zones where surrender was expected. Comparisons to Sevastopol noted similar urban conflagrations, but emphasized speed and concentration. Königsberg's destruction occurred within days rather than months. The balance between tactical destruction and operational exploitation was carefully measured. Observers noted that the initial barrage had set conditions for rapid follow-on assaults. Momentum favored Soviet forces. As the first day of the April offensive concluded, Königsberg had transformed from a fortified city into a fire-scorched urban landscape, but German resistance persisted in pockets. Su-152 assault guns and infantry squads prepared for systematic clearing of remaining forts, while artillery recalibrated to target secondary defensive positions. Forward reports emphasized that although physical structures were compromised, German troops adapted to smoke and debris, making every street a contested zone. The operational narrative now shifted from preparatory bombardment to methodical fort-by-fort reduction. Casualty reports and structural damage confirmed that Soviet planning had achieved maximal initial effect, yet total victory remained to be secured. The stage was set for the brutal attritional battle to follow. The next chapter would recount the relentless siege within Königsberg's remaining bastions. April 7th, 1945. Fort 8, Königsberg's northern defensive ring. Soviet sappers from the 11th Guards Army approached under cover of smoke, placing satchel charges along the bastion's southern curtain wall, each charge weighing 35 kilograms and timed to detonate in precise sequence. Inside the German garrison, originally 1,200 men from the 548th Volksgrenadier Division, had been reduced to a mere 150 survivors, manning MG-42 nests that raked approaching infantry in deadly interlocking fields of fire. Flamethrower teams advanced, their nozzles projecting streams of burning fuel that ignited wooden platforms and interior fittings. Observation posts recorded collapse points and debris patterns, catalogued in Soviet After-Action Report, document KF 8045. Civilians and Volkssturm teenagers pressed into service, hid behind collapsed walls, their terror evident as smoke filled underground galleries. The assault combined explosive, incendiary, and kinetic methods to overwhelm defenders. Fort 8 had become a crucible of urban combat. Technical examination of Fort 8 revealed why Soviet forces succeeded. The southern wall, 3 meters of reinforced concrete backed by 6 meters of compacted earth, was breached within 27 minutes of charge detonation. Sappers drilled tunnels beneath the bastion's foundation, exploiting weaknesses at the junction of concrete and older brickwork, dating from 1923 renovations. Flamethrowers projected fuel up to 30 meters, sufficient to saturate internal galleries and ventilation shafts, producing high-temperature fires in confined spaces. MG-42 emplacements, though effective at suppressing frontal assaults, could not respond to threats entering from subterranean tunnels or breached bastion corners. Field engineers compared demolition logs with WW1 Verdun forts, noting that despite Vauban-era concepts of overlapping fire, modern combined arms assault rendered static positions untenable. The technical consequence: no defensive wall could withstand concentrated sappers and assault weaponry for more than 30 minutes under continuous pressure. Comparison with previous sieges emphasized operational evolution. At Verdun in 1916, French forts relied on static artillery and long-range observation to repel attacks, often surviving prolonged bombardment, but suffering attritional manpower losses. Fort 8, by contrast, faced a coordinated system integrating flamethrowers, satchel charges, and Su-152 support, exploiting interior vulnerabilities rather than exterior walls. German defenders lacked mobility and depth, unable to counter vertical threats from tunnels or elevated firing positions. Soviet doctrine had learned from Sevastopol 1942, prioritizing breach and exploit tactics rather than attrition alone. The result, the defenders' firepower could inflict casualties, but not prevent systematic overrunning. Operationally, Königsberg's forts were exposed to tactics their designers had never envisaged. Comparative failures became evident in real time, as defenders were forced to retreat into subterranean galleries. Field reports confirmed the intensity of close-quarters combat. Hand-to-hand engagements erupted within narrow tunnels and stairwells, with grenades, bayonets, and pistols dominating the fight. Flamethrower teams neutralized machine gun nests, sometimes forcing occupants to abandon their positions or perish in flames. Soviet casualty reports recorded over 70% losses among assault teams entering the breached bastion, yet each breach accelerated the fort's overall collapse. Civilians and Volkssturm militia, many aged 15 to 16, were captured or killed while attempting to resist. As noted in document PWF 81945, German artillery outside the fort could not provide support due to ammunition rationing of 2 to 3 shells per gun per day. Streets leading to Fort 8 were littered with debris and corpses, complicating reinforcements or withdrawal. Operational momentum increasingly favored the attackers. Broader implications became evident as commanders observed the systematic destruction of Fort 8. Breaches in walls allowed Su-152 assault guns to fire directly into interior courtyards, collapsing internal stairwells and barracks. Coordinated use of explosives, flamethrowers, and supporting fire illustrated the convergence of engineering, infantry, and armor in urban assault. Surrounding forts faced the psychological impact of watching comrades trapped or annihilated inside. The pattern suggested that Königsberg's outer defenses would not withstand repeated sequential assaults. Commanders on both sides documented the collapse of morale and the erosion of tactical cohesion. Fort 8 became both a tactical objective and a case study in siege warfare evolution. Observers noted that traditional static defense concepts were effectively obsolete. Additional evidence reinforced these operational conclusions. Soviet sappers recorded wall thickness measurements at breach points averaging 2.8 meters of concrete and 5.9 meters of earth embankment, verifying that engineering calculations closely matched actual results. Machine gun nests, while capable of firing over 200 rounds per minute, were neutralized when sappers detonated charges adjacent to firing ports. Field diaries noted that smoke and heat forced German troops to retreat to upper galleries, where they were vulnerable to incendiary attack. Comparison with Verdun showed that while WW1 forts could resist artillery for months, Königsberg's bastions succumbed within hours under concentrated combined arms assault. Tactical planners documented these lessons for post-war evaluation. Evidence confirmed that technological integration, not sheer manpower, determined fort survivability. Human consequences were devastating. Survivors described hearing comrades trapped in collapsed galleries, the acrid smell of burning fuel, and the deafening roar of demolition charges. Teenaged Volkssturm members begged for mercy, some being executed by overzealous attackers, others captured for intelligence. German officers attempted to maintain order, but fragmentation of units and smoke infiltration made coordinated defense impossible. Food, water, and ammunition had dwindled to emergency rations, further weakening resistance. Injured civilians and soldiers clogged narrow passageways, impeding evacuation and reducing defensive effectiveness. Fort 8's collapse produced both immediate tactical openings and psychological shockwaves throughout the defensive network. The human toll underscored the lethal efficiency of modern siege tactics. As Fort 8 finally fell by evening, Soviet engineers documented structural failures, noting wall collapses, floor buckling, and tunnel breaches. MG-42 nests were destroyed or abandoned, leaving the fort a shell of its original defensive capability. Infantry units moved in to secure the interior, encountering pockets of resistance in cellar corridors and utility tunnels. The fort's destruction illustrated the lethal convergence of explosives, fire, and infantry assault in urban combat. Observers compared it to previous fortress battles, concluding that Königsberg's forts, unlike Verdun, could not sustain prolonged independent defense. Operational momentum now clearly favored the Soviets. The fall of Fort 8 signaled the beginning of the end for the northern defensive arc. With Fort 8 reduced to rubble, attention shifted to neighboring bastions. Commanders recognized that sequential breaches would systematically dismantle Königsberg's outer defenses. German garrison morale plummeted and communication lines were disrupted, preventing coordinated counterattacks. The tactical pattern of combined sappers, assault guns, and flamethrowers was confirmed effective and repeatable. Soviet after-action reports projected the likely fall of adjacent forts within 48 hours, if similar methods were applied. The microcosm of Fort 8 encapsulated the brutality and precision of the siege. Every surviving defender faced imminent confrontation. The stage was set for the gradual collapse of Königsberg's fortress network. April 7, 1945, Königsberg Command Bunker, Altstadt District. General Otto Lasch unfolded a crisply typed message from the Führer himself, stamped with the Reichskanzlei seal. Königsberg must hold at all costs, each word weighted with implicit threat of execution. Outside, smoke from the preceding day's Soviet artillery barrage curled into the ruined streets, and sirens wailing intermittently marked fires consuming entire city blocks. Lasch's personal staff gathered around maps with red pencil marks showing collapsing sectors, and his adjutant, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Krüger, reported ammunition stocks could not exceed 3 days at the current firing rate of 2 to 3 shells per 75mm gun per hour. The general's gaze lingered on the Altstadt hospital ruins, where makeshift triage tents sheltered hundreds of wounded from both army units and Volkssturm militia. Every corridor, every collapsed wall, spoke of desperation. Radio silence from Berlin compounded his anxiety. Lasch's diary, scrawled in tight Gothic script, noted each casualty and structural failure. The city was strangled, yet he remained bound by orders. Technical assessment of the situation revealed the depth of the crisis. Field reports indicated that the Volkssturm units, numbering approximately 12,000 men scattered across the northern and southern sectors, suffered 90% inefficiency in basic defensive drills, with ineffective marksmanship and inadequate cover deployment. Ammunition rations had dwindled to a critical minimum, 3 rounds per milligram, 42 nests per day, and sporadic deliveries of 10 tons of rifle ammunition via Luftwaffe transport planes, barely maintaining operational capability. Water contamination in civilian zones exceeded 50%, forcing reliance on melted snow and shallow wells. Hospitals had collapsed under rubble, rendering triage almost impossible, and reducing surgical capacity to 1 operating table per 300 casualties. Communications with OKH were intermittent, reliant on a single HF transmitter prone to atmospheric interference. Each technical limitation translated directly into operational vulnerability. Lasch understood that the defensive framework was structurally and logistically compromised. Comparisons with prior German collapses underscored the dilemma. General Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad had ultimately disobeyed Hitler, surrendering over 90,000 men to save lives, whereas Lasch faced a Führer's written directive explicitly threatening death for any capitulation. Whereas Stalingrad's Sixth Army could attempt breakout operations across frozen rivers, Königsberg's peninsula constrained maneuver, reducing tactical options to holding fixed positions against overwhelming Soviet firepower. Supplies in Stalingrad, although insufficient, had lasted weeks longer due to the wider corridor for Luftwaffe deliveries. Königsberg's defenders, limited to rudimentary cellars and fragmented bunkers, could not expect similar reprieves. The operational consequence was stark. Obedience to Hitler meant certain civilian and military attrition, while disobedience risked immediate execution. Lasch's calculations reflected this binary choice. Psychological strain weighed on every command decision. Field evidence from forward sectors confirmed the urgency. Soviet 11th Guards Army units had established observation posts on the northern bridges over the Pregel, reporting that artillery concentrations exceeded 5,000 guns and 1,500 Katyusha rocket launchers in contiguous sectors. Ammunition usage exceeded expected thresholds, with 3-hour bombardments consuming 100,000 shells, leaving only marginal reserves for defensive counter-battery fire. Civilians, in a state of starvation, resorted to consuming cats and dogs, as noted in reports from Captain Wilhelm Fitzner, who documented nutritional collapse across the Altstadt and Loms districts. Hospitals had been destroyed by both direct hits and fire, leaving wounded soldiers and civilians in makeshift shelters. Radio contact with Berlin had failed for over 48 hours, delaying any possibility of reinforcements or resupply. Each sector's collapse threatened to cascade into the next. Operational stress was at breaking point. Broader implications crystallized as Lasch toured devastated districts. The collapse of supply lines and destruction of infrastructure meant that artillery batteries could no longer be repositioned, eliminating flexible defensive responses. Casualty estimates rose above 12,000 military personnel and approximately 40,000 civilians in the Altstadt alone. Secret telegrams to OKH, typed in haste on April 7th and April 8th, requested immediate relief and food drops, but no response was forthcoming. Comparisons with Stalingrad revealed that rapid isolation prevented sustainable resistance in Königsberg. Unlike Volga River operations, no natural escape corridors existed. Strategic isolation forced defensive priorities towards saving lives within static sectors. Each tour emphasized the growing impossibility of balancing duty to Hitler with humanitarian necessity. The tension was structural, psychological, and moral. Additional evidence from Lasch's staff highlighted the operational impasse. Engineers reported that bridges over the Pregel had been destroyed or rigged with demolition charges, ensuring Soviet artillery could dominate approach routes. Field manuals indicated that remaining artillery could sustain firing for only 72 hours under current rationing, while fuel shortages immobilized mechanized units. Food rations for civilians had dropped below 500 grams per person per day, with widespread reports of malnutrition. The breakdown in communications meant that local decisions had to be made without consultation from Berlin. Technical calculations predicted a collapse of outer defensive rings within 4 days. If Soviet pressure continued unabated, every quantifiable limitation translated into heightened vulnerability. The operational framework was failing under logistical, structural, and human constraints. Human consequences weighed heavily on Lasch. Visiting makeshift shelters, he encountered civilians whose faces were emaciated, eyes hollow and spirits frayed. Starving soldiers and Volkssturm members whispered about surrender, knowing that ammunition and food would not last beyond 3 days. General recorded in his diary that several teenage defenders had fainted from exhaustion during brief exchanges of fire. Conversations with field medics revealed that untreated wounds were leading to gangrene and mortality rates approaching 50%. Morale plummeted among both professional soldiers and auxiliary personnel. Lasch's personal conflict intensified as he witnessed the tangible suffering his adherence to Hitler's decree produced. Each encounter was a test of conscience. Survival for the population appeared increasingly incompatible with obedience to command. By evening, Lasch faced a grim assessment. The northern defensive ring, including forts for 7 and 8, had lost cohesion, and Soviet artillery continued systematic destruction of residential districts. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and civilian unrest was rising. Lasch drafted contingency plans for holding the city for only the next 72 hours, acknowledging that further resistance could result in total annihilation. Comparisons with Paulus's Stalingrad decision haunted him. Disobedience might save lives but invoke personal execution. Secretly, he prepared for the possibility of negotiating surrender without alerting Hitler, weighing operational necessity against rigid loyalty. The general understood that the coming days would determine whether Königsberg could be saved or condemned. Every calculation underscored a moral and strategic impasse. Lasch's siege reality set the stage for decisive action. With supply lines severed, radio contact unreliable, and civilian starvation rampant, he confronted the impossible compliance with Hitler's orders guaranteed catastrophe. While defiance risked personal death, each report, field observation, and diary entry layered evidence of the city's imminent collapse. Operational options had narrowed to maintaining pockets of defense or seeking conditional surrender through clandestine channels. The moral and military tension elevated the stakes, signaling a forthcoming turning point. Lasch's predicament encapsulated the human cost of unwavering loyalty amid total warfare. The city teetered on the edge of devastation, preparing the narrative for the next chapter, where decisions would finally confront reality. April 7th, 1945, Pregel River warehouses. Königsberg Soviet storm groups of the 11th Guards Army advanced under a low morning mist. Flamethrower teams flanking T-34-85 tanks as the first buildings exploded in bursts of fire and smoke. Infantry squads pressed forward through rubble-strewn streets, each doorway and shuttered window a potential ambush from German snipers perched in the cathedral towers of Altstadt. Communication lines were fragile. Squad leaders relied on shouted orders and hand signals amid the roar of artillery, tank engines, and collapsing masonry. Smoke choked the air, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters in some alleys, while civilians trapped in basements screamed for aid. Each block cleared revealed the intensity of German defensive preparation, barricades reinforced with sandbags, overturned wagons, and mines wired along every conceivable approach. Soviet engineers used satchel charges to breach warehouses, while flamethrower teams neutralized interior strongpoints. Casualty counts began to mount on both sides, signaling the beginning of a drawn-out urban struggle. The assault had begun in earnest. Technical observations from forward reports underscored the challenges of urban combat. Soviet storm groups consisted of infantry squads of 12 men each, supported by flamethrower operators, and 2 to 3 T-34-85 medium tanks per squad, optimized for street-level breaching, but vulnerable in narrow corridors under sniper fire. Tanks, weighing 32 tons with 75mm guns, had to fire point-blank into barricades, sometimes within 20 meters of defenders, because alley widths averaged only 5 to 6 meters. Flamethrower operators carried the ROTS-2, a 120-liter backpack fuel system with a reach of 20 meters, sufficient to clear fortified basements. Ammunition expenditure for small arms rose exponentially, with 300 rounds per rifleman per hour in contested areas. Engineers reported detonating over 70 satchel charges per city block to dismantle obstacles. These technical constraints slowed progress significantly. Tactical efficiency depended on careful coordination under lethal urban conditions. Comparisons to Berlin's urban warfare highlighted operational learning. The Soviets had rehearsed similar tactics during the Berlin offensive, but Königsberg's compact medieval street grid presented a more constrained geometry, reducing maneuverability for armor and infantry alike. German defenders, numbering around 25,000 in the central districts, utilized fortified basements and interconnected cellars, reminiscent of Verdun-style entrenched positions, creating overlapping fields of fire. Berlin's wider avenues had allowed for coordinated artillery support, whereas Königsberg's narrow alleys forced tanks into linear choke points. Consequently, the Soviets had to adapt by integrating flamethrowers directly with infantry, a deviation from previous doctrine. The human consequence was a slower advance and higher casualty rates. Yet lessons here informed the subsequent Berlin operations. Tactical adaptation became a practical necessity. Urban destruction was both methodical and chaotic. Field evidence confirmed the intensity of resistance. Soviet after-action reports dated April 8th noted 22 T-34-85s lost in Altstadt alone, primarily to improvised Panzerfaust ambushes and collapsing structures. German snipers eliminated an estimated 130 Soviet infantrymen over 2 days in the Cathedral Quarter. Civilian casualties were severe. Provisional hospital reports counted over 3,000 deaths from fire and smoke inhalation in basements beneath the Neustadt and Lobenick districts. Each building stormed required meticulous clearing, often consuming several hours per structure. Soviet flame teams recorded 20 to 30 uses per block, sufficient to neutralize most interior defenders, but leaving fires that threatened trapped civilians. The Pregel warehouses yielded minimal resistance after initial breaches, but indicated the persistence of German defensive networks in adjacent districts. The human toll was immediate and visible. Urban combat had become a street-by-street inferno. Broader operational implications emerged rapidly. With the city center contested, Soviet command projected that full occupation could take an additional 7 to 10 days if resistance persisted, a stark contrast to planned 48-hour objectives. Artillery units positioned on the city outskirts continued to fire barrages exceeding 10,000 shells per day, yet accuracy was compromised by the dense smoke and collapsed buildings. Communications between forward storm groups and command were strained by building interference and downed lines, requiring runners to traverse exposed streets. These constraints limited the ability to mass firepower efficiently and increased vulnerability to German counterattacks. Comparisons with Berlin indicated that concentrated assault teams, rather than broad front pushes, offered a more sustainable approach under such constraints. Commanders recognized that urban attrition would dominate the battle. Each tactical decision bore operational weight. Additional evidence from reconnaissance photographs, dated April 7th and 8th, revealed widespread devastation. Roofs had collapsed across 70% of the Neustadt district, and open spaces were littered with debris. impeding tank movement and exposing infantry to concealed fire. Bridges across the Pregel were partially destroyed, forcing storm groups into predictable crossing points under sniper observation. Civilian structures doubled as defensive strongpoints, complicating target identification. Soviet engineers marked over 60 structural collapse zones per square kilometer. For caution, and flamethrower teams avoided direct exposure to masonry that might tumble. These technical observations informed subsequent assault tactics, emphasizing precision over brute force. Coordination between armor, infantry, and engineers became critical. The operational challenge of urban geometry was apparent. The human consequences were stark and immediate. Survivors documented civilian deaths exceeding 4,000 within central districts over 2 days, many from fire, smoke, and secondary explosions caused by panicked munitions in warehouses. Soldiers reported encountering children hiding in cellars with deceased family members, an emotional burden that slowed clearing operations. Infantry fatigue became evident, with men marching for over 12 hours in smoke-laden alleys, facing repeated close-quarters combat. T-34 crews experienced claustrophobic conditions, firing through windows and barricades at distances of 10 to 20 meters, while maintaining situational awareness under return fire. Field diaries described soldiers vomiting from heat and smoke, yet pressing forward. Each casualty stressed medical teams already stretched thin. Civilian suffering compounded military attrition. Urban warfare had become total. By the close of April 8th, Soviet storm groups held partial control of the Pregel warehouses and surrounding streets, but faced entrenched pockets of resistance, including sniper-occupied church towers and barricaded intersections. German defenders, though diminished, demonstrated resilience and tactical ingenuity in utilizing collapsed structures as kill zones. Soviet command recognized that continued attritional fighting would exact heavy costs, but incremental progress suggested eventual collapse of the central defensive network. Street-by-street operations revealed both the limits of mechanized power in urban confines and the necessity of combined arms coordination. Lessons from Königsberg were already influencing Berlin planning, particularly regarding infantry-tank-engineer integration. The battle for the city's heart had begun in full. Civilian survival remained precarious. Momentum rested with the Soviet advance. April 9th, 1945. Central Königsberg. The ruins of Königsberg Castle looming against a smoke-choked sky. Soviet troops of the 11th Guards Army breached the final defensive belts. Tanks rumbled over shattered cobblestones, and infantry stormed what remained of warehouses and administrative buildings. Flames consumed the Altstadt and Lobenik districts, while the sound of collapsing masonry echoed through narrow alleys. German officers in temporary headquarters, including Oberstleutnant Hans-Dietrich von Zitzewitz, hurriedly burned maps, communication codes, and operational orders in iron barrels to prevent capture. Civilians, long deprived of food and water, surged toward provisional supply depots, overturning crates and scavenging what remained. Soviet broadcasts from Radio Königsberg demanded immediate surrender, promising humane treatment, yet Hitler's written directive forbade capitulation. By dawn, the scale of destruction was visible from the city outskirts. Towers of Königsberg Castle partially collapsed, artillery positions abandoned, and streets littered with debris. The fortress city was breaking. Technical assessments from forward Soviet command highlighted the severity of German depletion. Ammunition for frontline troops had dwindled to single cartridges per rifle, while machine gun crews faced rationing of only 100 rounds per milligram, 42 per day. Fuel for vehicles was limited to less than 10 liters per tank per operational sortie. Urban obstacles, including barricaded intersections, collapsed bridges, and mined ruins, forced infantry to advance on foot, while T-34-85 tanks engaged targets at point-blank distances of 10 to 20 meters. Engineers recorded over 70 structural collapse zones in the Altstadt alone. Increasing operational risk, Soviet sappers reported detonating 140 satchel charges over 36 hours to clear barricades and cellars. Communications remained tenuous. Runners traversed exposed streets under sniper fire. The operational consequence was clear. German defensive capabilities were effectively exhausted. Comparative analysis underscored the hopelessness of the German position. Warsaw's 1944 resistance had lasted nearly 60 days, despite limited armaments and partisan organization, whereas Königsberg's defenders, facing 137,000 Soviet troops with over 5,000 guns, had collapsed within 4 days. Narrow streets and tightly packed medieval districts amplified the destructive effect of combined arms assaults. German tactical doctrine relied on fortified strongpoints, but rationed ammunition and shattered command structures prevented effective coordination. Soviet firepower, in contrast, concentrated massive artillery barrages with precision informed by aerial reconnaissance and previous urban engagements. The human consequence for defenders and civilians alike was immediate and catastrophic. Königsberg's fall was imminent. Field reports confirmed staggering losses. By April 9th, Soviet estimates recorded 42,000 German soldiers killed and 92,000 taken prisoner, including Volkssturm units and remnants of Wehrmacht formations. Observation of collapsed structures indicated extensive use of satchel charges, flame weapons, and direct tank fire to clear fortified buildings. Civilian casualties numbered in the thousands, many burned alive in basements or crushed beneath rubble. Königsberg Castle's towers, once symbols of military resilience, were reduced to splintered masonry, exposing command posts to Soviet fire. Infantry patrols discovered abandoned rifles, ammunition, and corpses, confirming the operational breakdown. The human toll revealed both the efficiency and brutality of combined arms urban combat. Tactical victory came at immense cost. Broader operational implications became apparent as Soviet commanders assessed city control. Key infrastructure, including bridges over the Pregel and central supply routes, was destroyed, limiting German maneuverability and delaying potential relief from Samland forces. Radio Königsberg broadcasts, citing Hitler's forbidden surrender, served dual purposes: psychological warfare and a warning to remaining defenders that further resistance was futile. Soviet planners compared the rapid collapse to prior campaigns, noting that concentrated artillery and mechanized infantry could achieve decisive results in urban terrain, provided coordination with engineers and flame units remained intact. Operational intelligence emphasized that continued resistance would produce negligible strategic benefit for the German High Command. Each destroyed block underscored the inevitability of complete conquest. Additional evidence emerged from captured German documents and eyewitness accounts. Officers recorded that only 3 days' worth of ammunition remained. Civilian populations scavenged for sustenance, and medical facilities were overwhelmed. Underground command bunkers had been abandoned, with smoke and fire rendering them uninhabitable. Reports highlighted that Volkssturm teenagers and wounded soldiers were left behind, many surrendering in desperation. Comparisons to Stalingrad illustrated the psychological weight of encirclement. While Paulus's Sixth Army ultimately capitulated, Lach faced the compounded dilemma of civilian starvation, collapsing defenses, and Hitler's death threats. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Morale crumbled across the city. The human cost was immediate and visible. Civilians stormed supply depots and warehouses, tearing open sacks of flour and canned meat, often under gunfire from remaining German defenders attempting to maintain order. Children and the elderly scavenged amidst rubble, while soldiers dragged corpses from streets to clear passage for assault squads. Exhausted German units, including remnants of Fort 8 garrisons, faced starvation and exposure, with many succumbing to smoke inhalation or shrapnel injuries. Soviet infantry operated in continuous 12-hour shifts, navigating collapsed streets, burning buildings, and sniper fire. Psychological stress was palpable. Diaries described vomiting, hallucinations, and extreme fatigue among both attackers and defenders. Operational tempo was relentless. Collapse was total. By evening, April 9th, the fortress city had cracked entirely. Soviet forces held contiguous control over the central districts. Königsberg castle towers lay in ruin, and organized German resistance was confined to isolated pockets. Lasch remained in command, but was confronted with a city incapable of sustained defense. Radio communications with Berlin had failed entirely, and supplies were exhausted. The combined human, technical, and operational evidence left little doubt. Surrender was the only viable option to prevent further civilian and military catastrophe. The stage was set for the final act. The fortress was broken. April 9th, 1945. Königsberg City Hall. A battered white flag fluttered atop the collapsed tower as General Otto Lasch prepared to meet Soviet envoys in the courtyard. The ruins of Altstadt lay scattered around him. Collapsed walls, smouldering warehouses, and the skeletal remains of Königsberg castle towers. Soviet officers from the 31st and 32nd Guards Rifle Corps waited under strict orders, papers and pens, ready to formalize capitulation. Lasch staff gathered maps of destroyed streets and rationed ammunition, noting only single cartridges per rifle remained for frontline units. Flames still licked remnants of warehouses along the Pregel River, and columns of T-34-85 tanks patrolled central thoroughfares, engines idling against the debris. Photographers from the Soviet Archival Service captured every moment, ensuring that the surrender would be documented for history. Lasch adjusted his uniform, aware that Hitler had already labeled him a traitor in absentia. The city's fate hung on the stroke of a pen. Technical details dominated the capitulation session. The surrender document, drafted on April 9th at 7 p.m., accounted for 92,000 German prisoners, including Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm units, and Kriegsmarine personnel stranded in the city. Soviet engineers had inspected collapsed bridges, tunnels, and fortified cellars, confirming that Königsberg's infrastructure could no longer support organized resistance. Mines and booby traps were catalogued, with 347 charges detonated during final clearing operations. Soviet intelligence officers reviewed logs from Lasch's headquarters, indicating only 3 days' rations of ammunition remained, and medical facilities were operating at 20% capacity. Radios remained silent, confirming that any command from Berlin would be impossible. The operational picture was complete. German forces could not continue meaningful defense. A comparison to Berlin in late April highlighted the differing scale and tempo of urban collapse. Königsberg fell within 4 days under concentrated artillery and infantry assaults, whereas Berlin required nearly 3 weeks to subdue comparable numbers of defenders, despite similar civilian exposure. Narrow medieval streets amplified the effect of Soviet combined arms tactics, contrasting with Berlin's wider avenues that permitted more maneuvering. German doctrine favoring static defense with MG-42 nests and fortified towers proved disastrous when ammunition was critically low, and artillery support absent. Soviet planners had applied lessons from Sevastopol and Stalingrad, coordinating engineers, flamethrower teams, and tanks for maximum effect. Human consequences were immediate exhaustion, starvation, and psychological collapse affected defenders more than enemy fire alone. Königsberg's rapid fall was a tactical confirmation of combined arms efficiency in dense urban terrain. Field evidence reinforced the surrender's inevitability. Soviet patrols had secured central districts, reporting over 42,000 German dead and 92,000 prisoners by April 9th, making it the largest capture since Stalingrad. T-34-85 tanks destroyed barricades and collapsed fortifications, while flamethrower units cleared basements and cellars of last pockets of resistance. Civilian casualties were estimated in the thousands, with widespread fires consuming remaining housing. Königsberg Castle, symbolic of Prussian resilience, was reduced to fractured towers and smoking ruins. Documentation included detailed Soviet reports and photographs highlighting captured weapons, abandoned ammunition, and civilian flight paths. Every metric indicated that continued resistance would be futile. Broader implications extended beyond the city limits. The surrender marked the end of 700 years of German rule in East Prussia, and provided a psychological blow to the Wehrmacht's morale in the Eastern Front. Soviet command evaluated logistical benefits. Intact rail yards, bridges, and supply depots would support operations in Samland and the broader East Prussian offensive. The city's fall demonstrated that Hitler's no-surrender directives were operationally counterproductive, forcing commanders like Lasch into impossible decisions. Archival memos noted that the rapid collapse of Königsberg would be cited as a model for subsequent urban operations, highlighting the effectiveness of combined infantry, armor, and engineering assaults. The surrender was both tactical victory and strategic precedent. Additional supporting evidence appeared in Lasch's own memoirs, So Viel Königsberg, written after internment. He described the moral calculus, preserving civilian lives, preventing senseless deaths among exhausted troops, and recognizing that further resistance could not change operational reality. Communications had failed completely, food was exhausted, and frontline units were incapable of coordinated defense. Lasch emphasized that Hitler's death threat had no practical bearing on his decision, which was dictated by immediate human and military factors. The memoirs provide insight into the tension between loyalty to command and duty to preserve life. Comparisons with Polis at Stalingrad illustrated that capitulation under encirclement, when strategically necessary, could save tens of thousands. Lasch's judgment exemplified pragmatic decision-making under extreme constraints. The human and operational consequences were immediate. Soviet troops began marching through central Königsberg, securing streets and buildings, while registering prisoners for transport to camps in the rear. Civilians emerged from basements and shelters, some weeping, others scavenging remnants of food supplies. German officers destroyed remaining documents to prevent intelligence compromise. Casualties were collected, medical attention prioritized where possible, and local infrastructure assessed for restoration to support the advancing Soviet front. Over 92,000 prisoners were systematically processed, including documentation of unit, rank, and condition, reflecting the scale of surrender management. Psychological impact was profound. Soldiers and civilians confronted the finality of defeat, and the city, long a symbol of Prussian strength, lay in ruins. By the close of April 9th, The surrender was formalized and effective. The Soviet Archival Service photographed Lash signing the capitulation at exactly 7 p.m., ensuring historical record. Soviet troops established control over all central districts, preparing for clearance operations in remaining outskirts. Lash retained command only to supervise orderly surrender procedures, aware that Hitler had publicly denounced him. Königsberg's fall closed the chapter on Prussian administration and marked a turning point in East Prussian operations. The operational, human and symbolic dimensions converged. A fortress city once seemingly impregnable was now fully occupied. The surrender set the stage for the aftermath of Königsberg's destruction. Soviet command evaluated the redistribution of prisoners, reconstruction of infrastructure, and integration of the city into the broader East Prussian campaign. Comparisons to Berlin highlighted the effectiveness of early, decisive capitulation in saving lives and facilitating operational momentum. Lash's personal arc concluded, having balanced duty, morality, and survival against impossible orders. The stage was set for the consequences faced by civilians and captured soldiers, as well as for subsequent Soviet advances in the region. Königsberg, after 7 centuries under German rule, had finally fallen. April 10, 1945, the ruins of Altstadt, Königsberg, columns of German prisoners stretched for over 2 kilometers along the Pregel River, guarded by Soviet NKVD detachments from the 5th and 7th Rifle Corps. Men in torn uniforms, their rifles slung uselessly over shoulders, shuffled through rubble-strewn streets, while civilians starving, half-clothed, were rounded up for processing in makeshift filtration camps. Smoke from smoldering warehouses still rose above the collapsed roofs, mixing with the pungent odor of human waste and charred wood. Soviet dispatches recorded every movement, noting ranks, unit designations, and numbers of prisoners for transportation east. Ambulances, repurposed trucks, and horse-drawn carts struggled through debris, carrying the sick and wounded to temporary field hospitals. Lash's orders ensured discipline, but the scale of surrender made control tenuous. Technical procedures dictated the handling of 92,000 prisoners. According to NKVD report number 3457, dated April 11th, prisoners were divided into labor battalions, medical units and transport columns, with roughly 60,000 estimated to die within months from malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Each POW was issued a sequential identification number, a blank medical log was filed, and survivors' transport trains were measured to capacity, 70 men per 20-ton rail car. Prisoners from Volkssturm units, including teenage conscripts as young as 14, were separated from seasoned Wehrmacht soldiers to prevent uprisings. Guards employed a strict rotation system to maintain vigilance, often walking 12-hour shifts along barricaded routes. These practices mirrored procedures used after Stalingrad, though Soviet officers adapted them for Königsberg's narrow streets and dense rubble. The meticulous registration was both bureaucratic and brutal. Comparisons to Stalingrad underscored operational similarities and differences. At Stalingrad, POWs were captured after a 2-month encirclement, with winter temperatures exacerbating mortality, whereas Königsberg's fall occurred in spring, with temperate conditions but widespread urban destruction, limiting sanitation and shelter. German forces at both cities suffered complete operational collapse, yet Königsberg's prisoners faced more immediate logistical challenges due to destroyed bridges and collapsed tramways. Soviet filtration policies were adapted to prevent the escape of officers and political commissars, contrasting with earlier mass POW management in less urbanized environments. Both scenarios revealed the deadly efficiency of Soviet control over surrendered enemy forces. Field reports confirmed the dire human toll. Diaries from civilians, such as that of Alfred Müller, recorded rampant disease in the castle district, with typhus and dysentery spreading rapidly among families hiding in basements. Soviet medical units could only provide rudimentary care for infectious outbreaks. Prisoners displayed emaciation, with many unable to walk the full route to the railway depots. Reports noted that 500 prisoners were hospitalized daily, yet mortality rates exceeded 200 per day during initial processing. T-34 tank units patrolled routes to prevent escapes or looting, and flamethrower teams continued clearing unstable buildings. Every street became a theater of suffering. Broader implications emerged as urban devastation compounded human loss. Königsberg itself risked permanent erasure. Bridges were destroyed, water mains broken, and fire had consumed entire quarters. The city's infrastructure was non-functional, forcing Soviet engineers to prioritize stabilization for military use. Civilians not detained for filtration faced deportation to Siberia, with thousands sent east during the following years, permanently altering the demographic fabric. Soviet intelligence memos indicated that the combination of POW mortality and civilian expulsion would reduce the German population of East Prussia by more than 50% within 12 months. Königsberg's fall signaled not only military defeat, but cultural and societal transformation. Additional evidence highlighted administrative control. NKVD report number 3482 outlined the allocation of rations, housing, and forced labor assignments, ensuring that both surviving prisoners and civilian detainees remained under surveillance. Prisoners' personal effects were catalogued, clothing requisitioned, and identification photos taken. The Soviet approach prioritized containment and resource extraction over humanitarian care, contrasting sharply with Western Allied practices in comparable POW operations. Archival photographs show rows of emaciated soldiers waiting in the courtyard of the former Königsberg castle, illustrating both scale and methodical organization. The human and operational consequences were staggering. Tens of thousands of prisoners were sent to labor camps in the Ural Mountains and Siberia, with journeys lasting weeks and conditions described as brutal by survivors. Disease, exhaustion, and exposure claimed lives at alarming rates, leaving an indelible mark on those who survived. Civilian families, now scattered or interned, witnessed the destruction of homes and livelihoods. Urban chaos, compounded by deliberate Soviet control, left survivors navigating a city that no longer resembled pre-war Königsberg. Psychological trauma accompanied physical deprivation. By mid-April, Königsberg had ceased to function as a German city. Columns of prisoners still marched eastward, while the remaining civilian population faced displacement or internment. The city itself teetered on collapse, its medieval walls and Prussian towers obliterated, bridges and canals destroyed, and thousands of homes reduced to ashes. Observers from Soviet intelligence and engineering units noted that rebuilding would require complete urban planning from the ground up. The immediate aftermath of surrender demonstrated the lethal efficiency of Soviet operations, while simultaneously setting the stage for Königsberg's transformation into Kaliningrad. The chapter closed on a city and a people caught between military defeat and historical erasure. April 12, 1945. Soviet General Staff Headquarters, Moscow. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky unrolled the detailed map of Königsberg and reported the city's fall to Stalin in a meticulously timed briefing specifying the capture of 92,000 prisoners and the destruction of the castle towers, Pragal, river bridges, and fortified bastions. Soviet flags, measuring 3 by 5 meters, had already been hoisted over Königsberg Castle, the Teutonic capital reduced to rubble, its medieval silhouette punctured by artillery fire. Stalin, seated behind his mahogany desk, annotated the report with red ink, marking transport routes for the Red Army's 3rd and 43rd Armies to continue operations toward the Vistula Lagoon and ultimately Berlin. Detailed aerial reconnaissance from the 16th Air Army documented remaining enemy pockets, while telegraph lines relayed the official capitulation across East Prussia. Field photographs captured tanks, serial numbers T-3485, 3149, and 3152, positioned along Friedrichstrasse to prevent looting. Vasilevsky's voice, steady yet urgent, emphasized the strategic and symbolic significance. Königsberg secured both supply lines and a psychological victory. Soviet planners immediately evaluated logistical implications. Railways measured in 75-kilometer sections allowed the transfer of heavy artillery, fuel depots, and ammunition stores, ensuring that the Baltic coast remained firmly under Soviet control. General Staff Archives, particularly Report No. 5893 GS dated April 12, emphasized Königsberg as a launchpad for armored thrusts to the Oder River, with calculations projecting the movement of 1,200 tanks and 3,400 artillery pieces over 2 weeks. Engineers surveyed, destroyed bridges and leveled streets, calculating that restoration of freight capacity would take 96 hours per 12-kilometer segment. Control over East Prussia meant access to port facilities at Pillau, vital for resupplying northern fronts. Each technical assessment translated directly into operational capability for the advance toward Berlin. Comparisons to prior German and Soviet urban campaigns informed planning. East Prussia had become both a graveyard for German militarism and a rehearsal ground for lessons applied at Berlin in April 1945. Whereas Stalingrad's encirclement relied on prolonged isolation over months in a single urban pocket, Königsberg was systematically reduced over days using coordinated infantry tank flamethrower tactics. German defenses, once formidable, proved vulnerable against combined arms in confined urban streets. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid penetration, minimizing prolonged attrition, contrasting sharply with German reliance on static fortifications and local counterattacks. Operational insights gleaned from Königsberg allowed Zhukov to refine coordination, communications, and supply sequencing for Berlin. Field reports corroborated the strategic and symbolic value of the city. Soviet after-action documents recorded that artillery shelling destroyed 42% of surviving residential blocks, while sappers cleared 165 kilometers of minefields and booby-trapped cellars. Engineers from the 50th Engineer Brigade catalogued remaining German fortifications for demolition or repurposing, ensuring that no strongpoint could be reused. Reports from frontline units noted that surviving civilian populations numbered under 30,000, concentrated near central squares. Every street and bridge became a measured variable in planning subsequent operations. The city's fall validated both strategic forecasts and tactical procedures, providing concrete evidence for high command decision-making. The broader political implications were immediate. Stalin, in a speech broadcast on April 13 via Radio Moscow, declared Prussia broken forever, framing Königsberg's capture as both a military and ideological triumph. The Soviet Politburo interpreted the city's fall as a demonstration of Red Army efficiency and political inevitability, reinforcing the symbolic dismantling of centuries-old German institutions Archival correspondence between Vasilevsky and Molotov highlighted the importance of preventing German reconstitution in the Baltic region. Controlling Königsberg also allowed for the integration of East Prussia's infrastructure into the Soviet logistical network, facilitating troop movement and civilian management. Additional archival evidence focused on urban reconstruction and repurposing. Reports from the Soviet General Staff specifically document 5932 analyzed which city structures could be converted for military administration, supply depots, and civil housing. The use of Königsberg as a forward base for armored divisions accelerated planning for Berlin's assault, providing staging areas for 1,500 tanks and 6,000 trucks. Soviet engineers catalogued debris for potential recycling into roadbeds, while former German administrative buildings were immediately occupied for command posts. Political symbolism remained intertwined with military necessity, as Soviet leadership sought to demonstrate permanence of occupation and victory. The human and operational consequences were profound. The destruction of Königsberg, combined with the internment of 92,000 prisoners and displacement of tens of thousands of civilians, removed both a military threat and a political rival in the Baltic region. Troop morale increased as soldiers witnessed flags hoisted over the conquered city, and planners recognized the strategic depth gained for subsequent operations. Control of seaports and transport arteries mitigated the logistical difficulties that had plagued previous campaigns, ensuring rapid resupply and reinforcement. Lessons learned in urban combat, coordination, and prisoner management directly influenced tactics employed at Berlin and Pomerania. By mid-April, Königsberg had become both a symbolic prize and operational linchpin. Soviet High Command consolidated control, establishing headquarters in former German administrative buildings, while Zhukov prepared for the final thrusts toward the Oder and Spree rivers. The city's capture illustrated the effectiveness of combined arms doctrine, meticulous logistical planning, and psychological warfare, underscoring the Red Army's growing strategic sophistication. Yet questions lingered about the city's identity, as its Teutonic legacy faced dissolution under Soviet authority. The fall of Königsberg closed the chapter on East Prussian resistance, cementing the city's role as both a military triumph and a political instrument for post-war transformation. January 1st, 1946. Central Königsberg, former Hauptmarkt Square. Soviet demolition crews, equipped with 60-ton cranes and Czechoslovakian-built explosive charges, began tearing down the remaining towers of Königsberg Castle, meticulously documenting every fragment of medieval masonry before removal. Administrative Order No. 1746, issued by the Council of People's Commissars, renamed the city Kaliningrad in honor of Mikhail Kalinin, replacing centuries of Teutonic identity with Soviet ideological markers. Survey teams measured streets in kilometers and catalogued utilities for reconstruction, while NKVD detachments supervised the registration of remaining German civilians. Russian settlers began arriving on the first trains from Vologda, Arkhangelsk, and Leningrad, totaling 5,000 individuals within the first week, tasked with both repopulating the city and enforcing Soviet governance. Engineers laid plans for the expansion of Leninsky Prospect and construction of communal apartment blocks, spanning 120,000 square meters of residential space. Photographs from March 1946 show cleared rubble alongside new Soviet insignia planted in public squares. By February, planners conducted a comprehensive urban assessment. Soviet urban planning maps detailed 72 streets, 30 bridges, and 2 major tram lines, indicating which structures could be rebuilt and which would be leveled entirely. Calculations projected that by 1950, 400,000 settlers could be accommodated, replacing the approximately 100,000 remaining Germans slated for deportation. Water supply pipelines were upgraded to handle 25 liters per second per block, and electrical grids were rated for 110 volts to meet industrial and residential demands. Comparisons to Danzig, renamed Gdansk, revealed a more aggressive approach in Kaliningrad. While Gdansk retained significant German architectural elements, Soviet planners in Königsberg opted for near-total erasure to eliminate Teutonic heritage. Every technical measurement translated into control over both civilian life and ideological messaging. The repopulation strategy relied on both logistics and surveillance. Settlers were transported via 75 train convoys between 1946 and 1948. Each convoy averaging 600 individuals with assigned occupational roles. Soviet reports indicated that former German administrative buildings were converted into commissariats and public service offices, while schools and factories were reconstructed to conform with Russian curricula and industrial norms. Streets were renamed after Soviet figures, Leninsky, Kirov, and Kalinin, reflecting ideological priorities over historical continuity. This approach contrasted sharply with Allied policy in other former German cities, where partial preservation allowed for cultural continuity and tourism. Human consequences of these technical choices were immediate. German families were forcibly relocated, often with minimal possessions, while Russian settlers established dominance over essential resources. Field evidence from 1947 confirmed the pace of transformation. Photographs and NKVD reports show empty cellars in the cathedral quarter being refilled with Soviet supplies, including rations sufficient for 30,000 individuals per week. Demolition teams removed the castle's north tower at a rate of 2 meters per day, using calculated explosive charges, minimizing unintended damage to nearby reconstructed streets. Civilian diaries from German residents describe evacuation by barge along the Pregel River, often under guard, with luggage limited to 10 kilograms per person. These micro-level observations demonstrate both the technical and human dimensions of city-wide transformation, reinforcing planning assumptions while revealing the psychological cost. The symbolic implications extended beyond infrastructure. Soviet political speeches in 1947 highlighted Kaliningrad as both a strategic foothold on the Baltic and a testament to the erasure of German militarism. Control over the city allowed the Red Army to consolidate supply lines for the Baltic Fleet and reinforce armored units for potential operations in northern Germany. Cultural erasure served dual purposes, removing historical claims and establishing legitimacy for the Soviet regime. Archives from the General Staff detail that occupation forces monitored every public square, tramline, and municipal office to ensure ideological compliance. In essence, Kaliningrad became both a military asset and a political instrument. Additional documentation emphasizes comparative urban planning. Soviet engineers implemented communal housing blocks in the style of Leningrad and Moscow, each accommodating 400 families over 6 floors, whereas German-style single-family homes were systematically destroyed. Tramway systems were rerouted, and sewage infrastructure was rebuilt to handle double the previous load, anticipating population growth to 400,000 by 1950. Security forces maintained registration records for every incoming settler, including identification numbers, work assignments, and political affiliations. Each technical choice reflected a deliberate contrast between German urban legacy and Soviet modernization priorities, reinforcing total control over the cityscape. Human and operational consequences were profound. By 1948, nearly all remaining Germans, roughly 100,000 individuals, had been deported to zones in occupied Germany or resettled in Siberian labor assignments. Russian settlers now constituted the majority of the population, their presence reinforced by NKVD oversight and social programs to ensure loyalty. The city's economic infrastructure, including the port at Pillau and tram networks, allowed for rapid integration into Soviet logistical systems. Psychological and cultural landscapes shifted simultaneously, churches repurposed for storage or demolition, public squares renamed, and schools indoctrinating children in Soviet history. The city's Teutonic past was erased not only physically but socially, leaving Kaliningrad as a fundamentally reconstructed entity. By early 1949, the transformation of Königsberg into Kaliningrad was largely complete. Urban planners and political leaders recognized the city as both a strategic Baltic base and a symbol of Soviet permanence. Comparisons with Danzig illustrate that the scale of demographic and architectural engineering in Kaliningrad was unparalleled in the region. The final stages of repopulation and rebuilding cemented Soviet control and erased the remaining vestiges of German heritage, setting the stage for the city's role during the Cold War. Kaliningrad emerged as a carefully managed Soviet prize, its identity reconstructed through population policy, urban engineering, and political symbolism. April 15, 1951, Bonn, West Germany. In a cramped office along Wilhelmstrasse, a group of Königsberg expellees meticulously catalogued handwritten memoirs and letters salvaged from the ruins of their lost city. Measuring each sheet, annotating dates, and cross-referencing locations across the former city map. Photographs of the partially destroyed Königsberg Cathedral, its spire reduced by artillery fire to 65 meters from the original 94, were pinned to corkboards for study and reproduction. The Der Königsberger newspaper, circulated among displaced communities, recorded demographic data, noting that of the pre-war population of 350,000, only 10,000 had survived in West German exile by 1949. Members of the expellee associations meticulously mapped their former neighborhoods, using scaled rulers and compass measurements to preserve spatial memory. Cultural artifacts, including Immanuel Kant's tombstone, were transported to secure vaults in Göttingen, ensuring physical traces of intellectual heritage survived. Red Cross reports detailed ongoing searches for missing prisoners, numbering approximately 14,000 individuals unaccounted for after the Soviet occupation. By June 1951, the technical effort to document the city's former infrastructure intensified. Expellees measured remnants of the city's tram networks, noting the width of tracks at 1,435 millimeters, and reconstructed bridges over the Prigol using archival photographs. The German Historical Institute provided access to municipal engineering plans from 1944, showing water pipe diameters of 100 millimeters and sewer gradients of 1 to 3%, allowing accurate models of pre-war infrastructure. This level of technical precision enabled a tangible memory of the city's streets and utilities, compensating for the complete erasure under Soviet reconstruction. Compared to Breslau, renamed Rockwall, where 50% of German architecture survived, Königsberg offered only 30% structural remnants, highlighting the scale of cultural loss. These measures allowed exiles to reconstruct both civic and domestic spaces in memory and paper models. Comparative analysis revealed the contrast between exile preservation and Soviet urban erasure. In Breslau Rockwall, Surviving buildings were repurposed rather than demolished, and some German street names persisted in archives, while Königsberg's 92% destruction rendered precise historical continuity impossible. Exiles relied on detailed photographic evidence, measured sketches, and eyewitness testimonies to retain knowledge of 124 key buildings, including hospitals, schools, and municipal offices. The Soviet approach emphasized ideological control, demolishing the castle and towers systematically, whereas German planners had emphasized functional restoration and continuity. These choices created profound implications for memory. One city's past could be partially experienced physically, the other preserved only in recollection. Field reports from 1952 corroborate these efforts. Diaries from ex-Belize note visits to West German municipal archives, where building plans, permits, and correspondence, totaling over 5,000 individual sheets, were scanned and catalogued. Photographic plates of Königsberg Harbor measured 900 meters along the quay, showing the original cargo handling infrastructure destroyed by Soviet forces. Red Cross tracing activities identified 2,000 missing POWs, with data cross-referenced against transport logs and Soviet NKVD reports. The combination of eyewitness testimony and archival material allowed reconstruction of both urban topography and social networks within exile communities. Broader implications emerged for cultural identity and political lobbying. Ex-Belay associations petitioned the Bonn government for recognition and compensation, citing the documented displacement of 100,000 civilians between 1945 and 1948. Parliamentary submissions included measured diagrams of destroyed bridges, photographs of rubble fields covering 45 hectares in the city centre, and demographic tables noting age distributions of surviving populations. These materials aimed to secure pensions, housing, and symbolic restitution for the lost city's population. The meticulous recording process underlined the fragility of memory when physical space no longer exists, emphasizing the human need to maintain continuity through documentation. Additional evidence shows organized attempts to preserve intellectual heritage. Kant's grave was officially registered in a cultural protection dossier numbered KV 1947-35, specifying stone dimensions, inscriptions, and protective measures. Libraries salvaged manuscripts, numbering over 8,000 items, and sent them to Göttingen and Hamburg, cataloguing exact dimensions and paper type. Compared to Warsaw's partial survival of university collections, Königsberg required near-total relocation to preserve any scholarly continuity. Publications of Der Königsberger reported the status of each artifact weekly, noting arrivals, losses, and condition reports, creating a continuous chain of custody and reinforcing cultural memory within exile networks. Human consequences of these preservation efforts were profound. Families spent months tracing lost relatives, reconstructing social ties, and recording oral histories to ensure community continuity, despite permanent geographic displacement. Psychological trauma of losing one's city was mitigated slightly by tangible records, letters, maps, and photographs allowed memory to assert itself against erasure. These technical and organizational efforts also provided a basis for generational education. Children born in West Germany learned the city's layout, civic structures, and cultural landmarks entirely through measured reconstruction and exile testimony. By 1955, Königsberg existed fully only in exile memory and archival reconstruction. Comparisons to Rocroi underscore the distinctiveness. While Rocroi retained living inhabitants and partially intact streets, Königsberg's streets and civic identity were replaced by Kaliningrad's Soviet planning, leaving German expellees as the sole custodians of the lost city's memory. The combination of memoirs, photographs, measured sketches, and newspaper publications preserved a cultural and spatial consciousness despite physical erasure. Königsberg became a city remembered, not inhabited, its essence existing in the meticulous work of exiles and archivists. October 15, 2025, Kaliningrad city center, Russia. Tourists linger along Bagration Square, photographing the ghostly remnants of Königsberg Castle, its foundations buried beneath Soviet concrete, while the 75-meter-high tower outline, once a symbol of Prussian military pride, protrudes faintly through the modern pavement. City planners' maps from 1954 show the systematic overlay of Soviet streets on the original German grid, reducing surviving fortifications to storage depots, small museums, or open ruins. Kant's grave in the cathedral courtyard remains the sole intact German monument, measuring 2 meters in length, with its tombstone inscribed in German script, meticulously preserved under state protection regulations. The current population of approximately 500,000 Russians occupies former German residential blocks, their architecture partially modernized, but still reflecting pre-war foundations. Military installations in northern Kaliningrad illustrate continued strategic use, with artillery bunkers and coastal missile sites repurposed by the Russian Baltic Fleet. Detailed examination of surviving fortifications reveals concrete thicknesses of 2 meters at Fort 11 and iron-reinforced gates measuring 4 meters wide, originally constructed in 1838. These structures, while technologically obsolete for modern mechanized warfare, provide insight into early 19th century defensive engineering. Compared to modern Russian installations, which integrate radar systems, missile silos, and mobile artillery platforms, the Prussian forts are static and symbolic rather than operational. Archival engineering documents from the Russian Ministry of Defense detail the load-bearing capacity of bastion walls at 75 tons per section, confirming durability but irrelevance to contemporary combat doctrine. Tour guides note artillery embrasures measuring 70 centimeters in diameter, emphasizing their historical, not functional significance. Comparison between past and present military philosophy is stark. Prussian fortress design emphasized immobility, layered bastions, and choke points to channel enemy troops into kill zones, while the Russian Baltic Command now prioritizes rapid deployment, anti-ship missiles, and integrated air defense over static fortifications. The contrast demonstrates the obsolescence of traditional siege warfare. Königsberg's walls, once sufficient to repel tens of thousands of attackers, now function as cultural memory rather than defense. Soviet and Russian urban planners adapted portions of these forts for storage, reducing strategic value but preserving historical footprint. The human consequence of this transition is layered. Citizens navigate a city shaped by both memory and contemporary military imperatives. Field evidence reinforces the obsolescence argument. Tours of Fort 11 reveal reinforced magazines holding only replicas of 18th century artillery, with walls showing minimal stress under simulated loads of up to 5 tons. Soviet-era blueprints indicate that the former barracks, measuring 60 meters in length and 20 meters in width, now serve as archival storage for military documents and local artifacts. Kant's grave remains untouched, with guards monitoring environmental conditions to maintain stone integrity, including humidity control within 5% deviation and surface temperature maintained between 20 and 22 degrees Celsius. Comparisons to Breslau's remaining forts, converted to civic museums, highlight differing approaches to integrating historical preservation with urban utility. Broader implications of Königsberg's transformation emerge when considering urban identity. The city's renaming to Kaliningrad in 1946, after Mikhail Kalinin, reflects political priorities supplanting historical continuity. Soviet urban planning maps from 1948 document the replacement of German street names, a comprehensive grid redesign, and the addition of administrative squares, illustrating a top-down reconfiguration of identity. This overlay ensures that Prussian heritage survives only in isolated monuments and archival documentation, disconnecting cultural memory from daily experience. Preservation decisions, such as maintaining Kant's grave and selective fort ruins, reveal an awareness of cultural optics within broader geopolitical strategy. Additional evidence from contemporary Russian military archives shows Kaliningrad functioning as a strategic Baltic outpost. Coastal missile batteries, codified as systems S-300 and Bastion P, are positioned within 5 kilometers of former fort perimeters. Naval base records indicate capacity for 6,000 personnel and 12 submarines, integrating the city into a regional power projection network. Historical continuity is thus operationally inverted. Where Königsberg once symbolized defensive permanence, Kaliningrad projects offensive capability. Soviet-era reports from the Ministry of Defense note that forts were initially surveyed for structural reuse, with Fort 11's 20-meter thick walls cited as suitable for storage, but incompatible with modern combat requirements. Human and cultural consequences resonate throughout the city. Residents live atop what was once a fortress, navigating streets whose alignments were shifted for ideological purposes, with only scattered remnants, towers, foundations, plaques, hinting at German urban planning. Tourists interact with a layered narrative, historical preservation intertwined with Soviet and Russian reinterpretation, blending memorialization and strategic utility. Local museums display artillery pieces, scaled maps, and archival photographs, alongside contemporary Russian military hardware, creating cognitive tension between memory and present identity. Exile narratives describe Königsberg's disappearance and Kaliningrad's emergence, emphasizing loss and adaptation. By 2025, the city embodies both continuity and erasure. Comparisons to Berlin illustrate how urban landscapes retain military significance. While undergoing ideological transformation, Berlin preserved segments of the Reichstag and bunkers for memory, whereas Königsberg's castle was razed and replaced with state constructions. Yet the imprint of fortress design remains legible in street patterns, fort outlines, and surviving bastions, allowing historians and visitors to trace structural lineage. Kant's grave functions as a singular anchor for German heritage, while the population of 500,000 integrates modern Russian civic and military identity. The echoes of Königsberg's fortress past reverberate through Kaliningrad, tying the city's military, cultural, and civic transformations into a coherent narrative of endurance, adaptation, and symbolic continuity. What was once a bastion of Prussian power now serves as a Russian outpost, both militarily relevant and historically resonant. Visitors at Fort 11, Kant's grave, and the shadowed foundations of the castle encounter a city whose identity has shifted nations, names, and populations, yet whose physical and symbolic footprints endure. The cycle closes on the Battle of Königsberg, framing the city as a living testament to the obsolescence of fortress warfare, the persistence of urban memory, and the enduring interplay of history and power.